Suitcase hit the mud with a sound like a slap. Gerald Potts hadn't thrown it hard, that was the worst part. He'd done it casually, the way a man tosses feed to chickens. One hand, barely looking. The leather buckle split on impact, and 3 weeks of Evelyn Hart's remaining life scattered across the frozen platform: a hairbrush, a tin of salve, Lily's extra stockings, a folded photograph she hadn't been able to leave behind. Station's closed to loitering, Potts said. He was already turning back toward the warmth of his booth. You want charity, try the church. Evelyn stood in the December wind with her 5-year-old daughter gripping her coat sleeve, and every person on that platform looking anywhere but at her face. If that were you standing there in the cold with a child at your side and nothing left to your name, what would you do? Don't move away from this story yet, because what happens next in Millhaven, what this woman does when the world decides she doesn't matter, is something that will stay with you. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next, and hit that like button so I know you're here. Drop a comment telling me the city or country where you're watching. I want to know how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, and I mean the real beginning, the part nobody talks about when they talk about brave women on the frontier. Evelyn Hart had not planned to become a mail-order bride. That particular piece of information mattered to her, even if it mattered to no one else. She had been married before, properly married. The kind where you stood in front of people who knew your name and made promises you intended to keep. She had kept hers. Robert Hart hadn't kept his, technically, but that wasn't entirely his fault. A man who gets kicked in the chest by a spooked horse at 31 years old doesn't exactly have time to reconsider his choices. Died on a Tuesday in early March. And by Thursday, Evelyn understood that the house they'd been renting, the farm equipment they'd been borrowing, and the goodwill of the community that had tolerated them for 2 years had all quietly evaporated. Robert had debts she hadn't known about. Not gambling debts, not shameful ones, just the ordinary accumulation of a man who always believed next season would be better. Promissory notes, borrowed tools, a loan from a neighbor that the neighbor was suddenly very interested in collecting. Lily had been 4 years old at the time of her father's death. She remembered almost none of it now, which was both a mercy and a small private grief that Evelyn carried without complaint. For 8 months, Evelyn had tried everything she could think of. Took in washing. She helped at the schoolhouse for a few coins a week. She moved twice, then a third time, finding cheaper and cheaper rooms until the cheapest room available was still more than she could manage. She was not stupid, and she was not idle, and she was not without skills, but she was a woman alone with a child in a world that had very limited uses for women alone with children, unless those women were willing to attach themselves to someone with means. She received the advertisement through the postal service, forwarded from her previous address to her current one already, a sign of how much moving she'd been doing. Rancher in the territory of Montana, it said. Established land. Modest income. Seeking a wife of practical disposition. Children welcomed. She'd read it 4 times. She'd thrown it away. She'd retrieved it from the waste bin the next morning, smoothed out the creases, and read it again. Man's name was Thomas Aldous. He'd included a brief letter with the advertisement, forwarded by the matching agency. He wrote in a plain hand about practical things: the house, the acreage, the weather in winter. Didn't promise love. He didn't promise warmth. He promised stability and fair treatment. At the bottom of the letter, in what seemed like an afterthought, he'd written, child in the house would be a welcome thing. Place gets quiet. That sentence was what decided her. Not the land, not the income, the quiet. She understood something about quiet that she suspected Thomas Aldous had only recently discovered. Quiet that follows a death is different from ordinary silence. It has a weight to it, a texture. It sits in rooms and watches you. Evelyn sold what remained of her furniture, packed what could fit into 1 suitcase, bought 2 train tickets to Millhaven, Montana territory. Journey took 9 days. On the 2nd day, the heating in their car stopped working properly and didn't resume until day 6. Lily developed a cough that Evelyn monitored with the steady, controlled dread of a woman who has learned that most problems don't announce themselves until they're already serious. Cough resolved on its own. Evelyn allowed herself to breathe again. She spent the long hours watching the landscape change outside the window. She was good at waiting, or rather she had trained herself to be good at it, which is a different thing. Being good at waiting means you find ways to keep your mind organized, to think through scenarios in advance, to prepare for what you might face. She considered what the ranch might look like. What Thomas Aldous might be like in person versus in correspondence. Whether Lily would warm to a new place quickly or slowly. She prepared herself for awkwardness, for the strangeness of meeting a stranger you're supposed to build a life with, the possibility that he might be disappointed in her appearance, or her manner, or her child. She did not prepare herself for him not being there at all. Train arrived in Millhaven at 3:30 in the afternoon. It was the 19th of December, and the cold came off the platform in waves even before the doors opened. Evelyn gathered their things carefully, the suitcase, Lily's small bag, her own coat pulled properly around Lily's shoulders, while Lily complained quietly about having to share it for the walk. The platform was not busy. A handful of passengers, a few men loading cargo, the station master visible through the window of his booth. Evelyn stood with Lily and waited. She waited 20 minutes. 30. The other passengers dispersed. The train pulled away with a great exhalation of steam, and suddenly the platform felt very exposed, the wind finding ways around the corner of the station building that it hadn't managed before. She went to the booth. Gerald Potts was a man of approximately 50, with the particular disposition of someone who has been the largest presence in a small space for so long that he's forgotten there might be other ways to be. He had a short white beard, wide shoulders that had run to fat, and the kind of eyes that measured people quickly and found most of them insufficient. "Excuse me," Evelyn said. "I'm looking for a man named Thomas Aldous. I was told he'd arranged to meet me here." Potts looked up from his ledger. He looked at her. He looked at Lily. He looked back at his ledger. "I don't know the name," he said. "I have correspondence." She produced the letters. "He's a rancher, I believe. He wrote that he'd be." "Lady, I don't keep track of every rancher in the territory. I'm not asking you to keep track of every rancher. I'm asking whether you've seen this specific man, or whether anyone left word." "Nobody left word." He said it with the finality of a door closing. "If your arrangement fell through, that's not station business." Evelyn stood very still. She had a particular way of going still when she was managing anger, a skill she'd developed over years, not suppression exactly, but containment, the way you bank a fire rather than put it out. "Could I wait here," she said carefully, "in case he's been delayed? It's very cold and I have a child." "Waiting areas for ticketed passengers." He didn't look up. "Station closes at 6. She waited another 2 hours inside the station, in the narrow waiting area, on a bench that had apparently been designed to discourage extended sitting. Lily fell asleep with her head on Evelyn's lap. Evelyn watched the door. 10 minutes to 6, a man came in from outside, spoke briefly to Potts. Glenn glanced over at her in a way that suggested they'd been discussing her. 6 o'clock exactly, Potts came around from his booth. "Time to go," he said. "I have nowhere to go." "Not my problem. My daughter is 5 years old, and the temperature is." Said time to go. He moved to the door, held it open. Cold air rushed in immediately, and Lily stirred and pressed closer against Evelyn's side without fully waking. Evelyn stood. She picked up the suitcase with one hand and took Lily's arm with the other, guiding her daughter upright. She walked toward the door with her back straight, and her face composed because there were still a few other people watching, and she had decided, not now, not in front of strangers, not with Lily half asleep and vulnerable, that she would not give Gerald Potts the satisfaction of seeing anything break. She was almost at the door when his hand came down on the suitcase handle. "I'll take that," he said. And before she could respond, he'd picked it up and walked out onto the platform ahead of her. Thought for a half second that he was going to help her. That he'd had a change of heart at the last moment, that there was something salvageable in him. Then he tossed it, not at her. Just away from him, a casual, contemptuous arc that sent it skidding off the edge of the platform and into the frozen mud below. Buckle hit a frozen rock and cracked. The suitcase fell open. 3 weeks of Evelyn Hart's remaining life spread across the ground in the December cold, while Gerald Potts walked back inside and closed the door behind him. Lily was fully awake now. "Mama," she said quietly, in that particular tone children use when they're frightened but trying not to show it because they've noticed their parent is already managing something. "It's all right," Evelyn said. She was already climbing down from the platform, moving carefully because the footing was poor and she couldn't afford a twisted ankle. "Stay there, stay on the platform. Don't step down yet." She gathered her things from the mud. The hairbrush was salvageable. Tin of salve was fine. The photograph of herself and Robert on their wedding day, the only one she'd kept, had landed face down and was muddy but intact. She turned it over, wiped it against her skirt, put it in her coat pocket rather than back in the ruined suitcase. She got Lily's stockings out of the mud. She got the rest of what she could find. Suitcase wouldn't close anymore. The buckle was completely gone. She used the belt from her dress to tie it shut in a way that would hold for perhaps an hour if nothing went wrong. Then she stood in the frozen mud with her repacked suitcase and her 5-year-old daughter and looked at Millhaven. It was not a large town. She could see the whole of the main street from where she stood. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a few other storefronts. Lights were beginning to show in windows as the afternoon went toward evening. She estimated she had maybe 40 minutes of reasonable light left. She could go to the saloon. She rejected this immediately, not from propriety, but from calculation. A woman alone with a child, clearly stranded, be in a saloon. She'd be taken advantage of before she got her coat off. She could find a boarding house. She had some money, not much, but some, the remnant of what she'd gotten from selling the furniture. Enough for perhaps 2 nights in a modest boarding house, if this town had one, which she didn't know. She started walking. The boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Clara Finch, who was perhaps 60, with a manner that was not unkind but was very direct about money. She quoted a price per night. Evelyn did the arithmetic in her head, looking at how many nights that money would last and what she'd have left after, and felt the familiar sensation of a wall getting closer. "I can offer 3 nights," Evelyn said. "After that, I may need to make different arrangements, but I can pay the 3 nights in advance." Mrs. Finch looked at her for a long moment, then at Lily, then back at Evelyn. "You're the one Potts threw out of the station," she said. "Wasn't a question. I didn't realize word traveled that fast. It's a small town." A pause. "The man you were supposed to meet, Aldous, was it?"
Yes.
Another pause longer. Mrs. Finch's expression shifted in a way Evelyn couldn't quite read. "I'll take your 3 nights," she said finally. "There's a back room on the ground floor. Small, but it'll be warmer than standing outside." Lily ate supper in the kitchen. Mrs. Finch produced a plate of beans and bread without being asked, which Evelyn noted and filed away as evidence of a decency the woman didn't advertise. Evelyn sat across from her daughter and watched her eat and thought about Thomas Aldous. Something in Mrs. Finch's pause when she'd heard his name. After Lily was asleep, Evelyn came back to the kitchen, where Mrs. Finch was washing dishes. "The man Aldous," Evelyn said. "You know something about him." The older woman kept washing. "Not my place to say, Mrs. Finch. I traveled 9 days on a train with a 5-year-old. I need to understand what I'm dealing with." A long silence. Sound of water, the clink of a dish. "He's gone, Mrs. Finch said finally. "Left town about 3 weeks ago. His ranch, whatever he had out there, I heard it was sold. Debt, maybe. I don't know the particulars." She set down the dish. "He was a quiet man. Kept to himself. Didn't tell folks his business. But he left, and then word came about a woman being expected on the train, and nobody—" She stopped. Shook her head. "Nobody thought to send word, I suppose." Evelyn stood in the kitchen and absorbed this. 3 weeks ago. He'd left 3 weeks ago. Guy. Which meant when he'd placed the advertisement, when he'd written those letters, when he'd promised her stability and fair treatment, and a child would be a welcome thing, he'd already been in the process of losing whatever he'd been offering. Guy. Whether he'd known it and written anyway, or whether the collapse had come after, and he simply hadn't thought to warn her, she didn't know. She suspected she would never know. "Thank you," she said. "Telling me." Mrs. Finch picked up another dish. "Some sleep. You look like you've been managing for a long time." She didn't sleep well. She lay in the small back room while Lily breathed steadily beside her, and she did what she always did when sleep wouldn't come. She thought through the problem. Systematically, with as much honesty as she could manage about what was real and what was wishful thinking. Assets, some money, decreasing. Lily healthy, her own health. Skills, she had numbers. Bust household management. Some farming knowledge from her own childhood. Literacy. The ability to stay calm when things went wrong. Liabilities, no contacts in this town, no arranged situation. No home, no income. The money she had would last perhaps 2 weeks in a boarding house, less if anything went wrong with Lily's health or her own. She needed work. Real work, not washing or taking in mending. She needed something that paid enough to matter. A town this size in winter, those options were extremely limited. The obvious answer was to find a new arrangement, another man, another offer. Some she might not have. And she refused to do it from a position of pure desperation, because decisions made from pure desperation generally produced outcomes that required more desperate decisions afterward. She was still lying there, thinking when the snow started outside the window. She listened to it fall. There was a quality to the silence in a snowstorm that was different from ordinary silence, softer somehow, but with more weight. She thought about Robert. About the way he'd always been certain that next season would be better, and about how that certainty had been both his most exhausting quality and the thing she'd loved most about him, because at least one of them had been able to believe it. She was going to have to be that person now. For Lily, she was going to have to believe that next season would be better, even while she was calculating exactly how many coins she had left and exactly how many days those coins would last. She fell asleep sometime near dawn, still working through the numbers. Next morning, she went back to the station. She was not entirely sure why. There was nothing there, for her no Thomas Aldous. No resolution, no apology from Gerald Potts, though she did not expect one. But she found herself needing to see the place again in daylight, to look at it clearly, rather than through the haze of shock and cold and the specific focused effort of not falling apart in front of her daughter. She left Lily with Mrs. Finch, who'd offered without being asked, which Evelyn noted again. Morning was very cold and very bright. The snow from the night before had been modest an inch, maybe two, and the main street of Millhaven had tracks through it already where the early risers had been. She walked to the station with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath making small clouds in front of her face. Platform looked different in daylight, smaller. Mud where the suitcase had landed was now frozen solid, the impression of the impact still visible in the ice. Stood and looked at it for a moment. Then she heard men's voices from around the side of the building. She didn't mean to listen. She simply went still the way she did sometimes when something in the air changed and the voices were not quiet. Doesn't matter, Potts. She can't stay at Finch's indefinitely. Not my problem what she does. It becomes the town's problem if she ends up. She made a foolish choice coming out here on a stranger's word. That's on her. She's got a child, Gerald. Plenty of people have children. Potts's voice, flat and certain. I'm not running a charity. A pause. Then the other voice, quieter. Caleb Whitmore was in town yesterday. Place is short-handed. Might be worth. Whitmore doesn't need a woman with baggage on his property. Don't know what Whitmore needs. I know he's got enough trouble without adding hers. She heard footsteps, the other man leaving, probably, and then the door to the station opening and closing. She stood very still on the platform for another moment. Caleb Whitmore, a ranch, short-handed. She asked Mrs. Finch about him over breakfast. Caleb Whitmore. The older woman said the name carefully, the way you'd handle something you weren't sure about. He's a good man, from what I can tell. Keeps to himself more than most. Has a ranch about 6 miles east, good land, water from the creek, decent herd size last I heard. A pause. He's had a hard stretch this past year. There's talk of trouble with land business, though I don't know the details. Wife passed 3 years ago. No family? A brother somewhere, I think. Nobody local. Mrs. Finch refilled Evelyn's coffee. Why are you asking? I heard his name mentioned this morning. The older woman looked at her steadily. He came through town yesterday evening, late. I saw him through the window he passes sometimes when he's got business at the hardware. A pause. Might come back today for his order. Evelyn nodded. She drank her coffee. She was calculating already. She was not going to sit in a boarding house and wait for her money to run out. She was not going to wait for someone to solve this problem for her. She was not going to approach this Caleb Whitmore like a woman who had nothing to offer, because she did have things to offer. She just needed to be precise and honest about what they were. She spent the morning in Mrs. Finch's small sitting room with paper she'd borrowed and the stub of a pencil, writing down everything she knew how to do. Not in vague terms, specifically. Quantities and methods and evidence. Household management. Bookkeeping, she'd kept Robert's accounts, and before that, her father's. Animal husbandry at a basic level. Cooking for large numbers, she'd helped run a harvest kitchen 2 seasons running. Medical basics. Sewing and clothing repair. The kind of systematic cleaning that prevents rot and pest damage rather than just making surfaces look presentable. She wrote it all down. She looked at the list. It was not impressive on its surface. These were ordinary skills, things most women in the territory could claim. She'd seen in her years of watching households and farms how rarely these things were done with any real system. How much money and material was lost every year to disorganization, to not knowing what you had and where it was, to fixing things after they'd broken instead of before. That was what she had to offer. Not labor, exactly. Intelligence applied to practical problems. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket next to the photograph of Robert. She was at the hardware store at 2:30 in the afternoon when Caleb Whitmore came in. She'd been waiting for about 40 minutes, browsing without buying, which the hardware store owner, a patient man named Simons, had tolerated without comment. She'd spent the time looking at what was on the shelves and thinking about what a working ranch in this territory would need and what it typically couldn't afford and why. She knew Caleb Whitmore by how he moved. He was perhaps 35 tall, but not imposing the height of someone who'd worked hard all his life, rather than the height of someone trying to intimidate. Dark hair, some gray coming in at the temples. His coat was good quality but old, the collar worn. He moved through the door with the particular efficiency of a man who always had somewhere else to be and was constantly calculating whether there was time. Spoke to Simons at the counter. Something about an order, a specific type of bolt or fitting. His voice was lower than she'd expected, unhurried, even when the rest of him was moving with purpose. She crossed the store before she could think herself out of it. "Mr. Whitmore?" He turned. He looked at her with the frank, unguarded expression of someone who genuinely didn't know what to expect. "My name is Evelyn Hart," she said. "I arrived in Millhaven 2 days ago as a mail order arrangement that didn't materialize. I have a 5-year-old daughter, no local connections, and approximately enough money to last 11 more days. I'm not looking for charity, and I'm not looking for a husband." She paused. "Just long enough. I understand you're short-handed at your ranch, and I want to know if you're willing to hear what I can do." There was a silence. Behind the counter, Simons had gone very still. Caleb Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Not the way Potts had looked at her, that measuring dismissal, but differently. Like he was actually looking at her. Like he was thinking. "How do you know I'm short-handed?" he said. "I heard it mentioned." "By who?" "By someone who didn't think much of the idea of telling you about me." Something shifted in his face at that. Not a smile exactly, more the acknowledgement of a smile. He glanced at Simons, who immediately found something very interesting to look at on the shelf behind him. "What kind of work?" Caleb asked. She took the folded paper from her coat pocket and held it out. "I wrote it down." He took it, he read it again. She watched him read, without trying to manage his reaction. It was harder than it might sound. She had a strong instinct to explain or justify each item. Nah, and she suppressed it. Because a woman who explains herself before she's asked has already suggested she doubts herself. When he finished, he folded the paper and held it for a moment without giving it back. "Kept accounts," he said. "My husband's and my father's before that. 2 different systems, which is how I know both. And the harvest kitchen, how many men? 37 at peak, 12 for the regular season." He nodded slowly. "I've got a ranch that's been running without a system since my wife died. I've got a household that eats too much and wastes too much because nobody's managing it. I've got records that need to be in better order than they are, and I haven't had time." A pause. He looked at her steadily. "I can offer you a room, you and your daughter. Proper room with a door and wages. Not high wages, because I can't afford high wages right now, but honest ones. Honest work. That's what I'm asking for," she said. Another pause. "You'd be starting in winter. The hardest time." "I know. My hands aren't going to welcome a woman from the east coming in and reorganizing things. That's a problem I'll solve." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he held out the folded paper. She took it back. "When can you start?" he said. "Tomorrow morning," said Evelyn Hart. "That suits you." He nodded once, paid for his order, and walked out. Simons waited until the door had closed before looking at Evelyn again. "Well," he said. "Yes," she agreed. She walked back to Mrs. Finch's boarding house through the December cold, with her hands in her pockets, and her breath making small clouds in front of her, and the folded paper still warm against her fingers. Wind was sharp, and the light was already going, and 6 miles east across winter-hardened ground was a ranch that was struggling, and a man she didn't know, and work that would be harder than anything she'd done before. She thought about the mud where her suitcase had fallen, impression still frozen into the ground. She thought about what Potts had said to the other man that morning. She made a foolish choice coming out here on a stranger's word. Maybe she had, but she was still here. She was going to get up tomorrow morning and go 6 miles east and start taking apart the problems she found there, one by one, the way she always had, the way she always would. Lily was waiting for her at the boarding house, sitting at the kitchen table with Mrs. Finch, both of them concentrating on a simple card game that Mrs. Finch had apparently taught her that afternoon. "Mama," Lily said, without looking up from her cards. "I won twice." "That's my girl," Evelyn said. She sat down at the table and looked at her daughter's small face, concentrated and serious over her hand of cards, and something in her chest that had been clenched for a very long time loosened just the smallest fraction of an inch. Not relief, not yet, but the beginning of the possibility of it. That would have to be enough. The morning Evelyn arrived at the Whitmore Ranch, the temperature was 9 degrees and falling. Caleb had sent one of his hands into town with a wagon at first light, a young man named Percy, perhaps 19, who spoke very little and drove very competently, and spent the entire 6-mile ride staring at the horses' ears as though they might do something interesting. Lily sat between Percy and Evelyn on the wagon bench with her wool blanket wrapped twice around her shoulders, watching the frozen landscape pass with the alert, cataloging attention of a child who has recently learned that the world is larger and stranger than she was initially told. "Is that the ranch?" Lily asked at one point, pointing at a cluster of buildings in the distance. "Too small," Evelyn said. "How do you know?" 6 miles is farther than that." "Percy," she said, "how far is 6 miles?" Percy blinked. It seemed to be the first time he'd been addressed directly in a while. "About an hour by wagon," he said, "give or take." "We've been on the wagon an hour." "Give or take," Percy said again, and that was the end of that. They arrived at the Whitmore Ranch at 8:30 in the morning. Evelyn saw it before Percy turned the wagon onto the access road, a cluster of buildings in a slight natural hollow sheltered from the worst of the north wind by a long ridge to the northwest. Main house, barn, 2 outbuildings, a bunkhouse set apart at a practical distance. Creek that Mrs. Finch had mentioned was visible as a dark line through the snow to the east. Everything looked functional, and nothing looked new, and the specific combination of those two things told her a great deal about what kind of operation this was. Caleb was waiting on the porch. He'd been working already. There was mud on his boots, and something that looked like axle grease on his left forearm, which he'd apparently forgotten about when he came to meet the wagon. He watched them pull up with an expression that was professional and measured, the expression of a man trying to evaluate a decision he'd already made and couldn't unmake. "Mrs. Hart," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." She climbed down from the wagon before Percy could offer to help. Then she lifted Lily down after her. "This is my daughter, Lily." Lily looked at Caleb with the particular seriousness of a 5-year-old who has decided to form her own opinions. "You're tall," she said. "I've been told," Caleb said. He looked down at her for a moment. Something moved briefly across his face that he controlled quickly. "There's oatmeal in the kitchen if you're hungry." "I like oatmeal," Lily said, immediately reassessing her opinion of the situation. Evelyn looked at Caleb over her daughter's head. He was already looking back at her. "I'll show you the house," he said. The house had good bones and no management. Evelyn understood this within 30 minutes of walking through it. Not dirty exactly, whoever had been maintaining it had at least kept the surfaces swept and the dishes washed. But there was a particular kind of disorder that comes from people doing the minimum to get through each day without any thought to. Systems that make daily survival less effortful. Supplies were stored without logic. The root cellar had food in it that should have been used months ago and a shortage of things that were needed now. Caleb showed her a ledger without her asking, which she marked down as a sign of either unusual trust or unusual desperation. Possibly both were maintained in a system that wasn't wrong so much as inefficient. Kind of bookkeeping that tracked transactions without telling you anything useful about patterns. "Who's been keeping these?" she asked, turning a page. "I have, when I have time, which isn't often, not in winter. Not any time, honestly." He was leaning against the doorframe watching her read, arms crossed, jaw set in the way of a man who knows someone is finding problems and is deciding whether to be defensive or useful about it. "Is it bad?" "No." She turned another page. "It's incomplete." "Which is different. You're not losing track of money. You're losing track of information. There's a difference between knowing you spent $12 on feed last month and knowing whether $12 was the right amount to spend, whether you could have bought in bulk and paid $8, whether the supplier's been consistent or variable." She closed the ledger. "Money itself is fine. The picture it's giving you is poor." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife used to say something like that." Evelyn didn't ask about his wife. It wasn't the right moment, and it wasn't her business yet. "I can fix the system," she said. "It'll take me a few days to understand what's here and a week or two to rebuild it properly. But after that, you'll be able to look at one page and know the state of this ranch better than you do right now from reading the whole book." He nodded slowly. "What else?" "The root cellar. I'll need to take inventory this afternoon, and we'll need to adjust what's being used in what order. Going to lose things if you don't." She paused. "Bunkhouse chimney is smoking wrong. I could see it from outside." That's a fire risk in a structure full of men who sleep with their boots on. Something changed in his expression. A small thing. Guy noticed the smoke was off, he said. Meant to look at it. I'm not criticizing, I'm listing. She set the ledger down on the table. I'd like to meet the hands today, if you're willing. On your terms, I'm not suggesting you announce me as anything more than what I am. I just need to know who I'm working with. He was quiet again, studying her. They're going to be difficult, he said. Some of them. I know, Holt especially. He's been here 12 years and he has views about Caleb stopped. About women from the East who don't know the frontier, Evelyn finished. More or less. All right. She picked up her coat from the chair where she'd put it. Let's go meet Holt. There were 6 hands working the Whitmore ranch that winter. She met them one by one, gore in pairs. Over the course of the morning, some in the barn, some near the outbuildings. One named Sam, who was fixing a harness in a lean-to attached to the back of the bunkhouse, and who shook her hand gravely and said ma'am without any particular emphasis, which she appreciated. Holt was the last. He was in his mid-40s, built like someone who'd spent 4 decades doing physical work and intended to keep doing it, with a gray-streaked beard and hands that were roughly twice the size they should have been. He was shoeing a horse when Caleb brought Evelyn to him, and he kept working for a moment after they arrived before he straightened up and looked at her. Look was not hostile. That was the surprising thing. Simply thorough. The way you'd examine a piece of equipment before trusting your life to it in bad weather. Holt, Caleb said. This is Mrs. Evelyn Hart. She'll be managing the household. Taking over the accounts, Heard, Holt said. His voice was flat Montana, every syllable a statement. I wanted to introduce myself properly, Evelyn said. I know you've been here a long time. 12 years. Then you know this ranch better than I do. I'm not coming in to tell you things about the land or the animals or the work you do out here. That's not my place, and I know it. She paused. I'm coming in to manage what happens in the house and in the books, and I'll do that without getting in your way. I'd appreciate the same. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Then he looked back at the horse and picked up the hoof he'd been working on. Bunkhouse chimney's been smoking wrong for 3 weeks, he said without looking up. I'll see to it today, Evelyn said. A pause. Just the sound of metal on hoof. Breakfast comes late on Tuesdays, he said. Percy's in charge of it, and Percy can't manage his time. I'll fix the schedule. Another pause. Welcome to the ranch, Mrs. Hart, said Holt. It was not warm, but it was a door left ajar rather than a door closed, and Evelyn had learned long ago that a door left ajar was enough. She fixed the bunkhouse chimney that afternoon. It wasn't a complicated problem, a partial blockage in the flue from accumulated soot, and the cap sitting slightly wrong from where the wind had moved it. Evelyn was on the roof within an hour of identifying it, which was an activity that produced a period of complete silence from the 2 hands who were watching from the yard below before one of them went and got Holt. Holt stood in the yard and watched her work with his arms crossed and an expression that was impossible to read. Done that before, he said when she was coming down the ladder. My father's house, she said. Twice a year. He didn't like heights. Pause. Most women don't like heights either. I'm not most women. She said it without emphasis, without challenge, just a statement. Holt looked at her for a moment, then gave one slow nod and went back to what he was doing. Percy, who had been watching from the barn doorway, disappeared quickly back inside. Sam, who had been the one to watch the whole thing without going to get anyone, simply said, Good work. Meant it. First 2 weeks were a matter of systems. Evelyn moved through the ranch the way she always moved through problems systematically, starting with what was most urgent and working outward. Root cellar inventory took a full day. She found 3 sacks of potatoes that were turning and had to be used or discarded, a barrel of salt pork that was fine but had been buried under things that needed to come out first, and a shortage of cornmeal that explained why the Hand's biscuits had been wrong for a month. She reorganized the cellar in a morning, labeled everything in her precise handwriting on strips of paper tacked to the shelving, and produced a list of what needed to be purchased and in what order of priority. She gave the list to Caleb without comment. He read it. He looked at her. This is more organized than anything we've had since Margaret died, he said. Margaret was your wife? Yes. A pause. She was good with the house. Better than I understood at the time. Evelyn waited to see if there was more. Wasn't. I'll need to be taken to town once a week until we're caught up on supplies, she said. After that, probably every 2 weeks. Percy can take you. Percy's fine. She picked up her list. And I'd like to go through the accounts again this evening, if you have time. I have some questions about the land records. Something shifted in Caleb's expression at that. A small tightening that could mean several things. The land records, he said. The property boundaries, water rights, that kind of thing. I need to understand the full picture of what this ranch holds in order to do the books properly. Pause. Tonight then, he said after supper. She noticed that he didn't say anything else about the land records. She noticed that his jaw had done the tight thing again, the one she was starting to recognize as the particular set he got when something was weighing on him and he'd decided not to talk about it yet. She didn't push, she filed it and moved on. Lily adapted to the ranch with the unsettling ease of a 5-year-old who had not yet developed the self-consciousness that makes adaptation difficult. By the end of the first week, she had decided that Sam was her favorite because he let her watch him work on equipment and answered her questions with genuine patience. She had decided that Percy was amusing because he was easily surprised. She had formed a cautious, mutual assessment with Holt that involved minimal words and maximum observation, which was, Evelyn thought, probably the right approach for both of them. Kitchen became Lily's domain in the mornings, while Evelyn worked through the accounts. Mrs. Finch had apparently taught her girl more card games than the one Evelyn had witnessed, and she spent the breakfast hours teaching them to whoever was in the kitchen, with varying degrees of success. Evelyn was aware, in the way that mothers are always aware, of something happening 2 rooms away without quite hearing it, of the moment when Lily started to feel at home. It was about 10 days in. She was working at the kitchen table with the ledger when she heard her daughter laugh at something, in the next room not a polite laugh, not a public laugh, but the kind that catches you off guard, kind that sounds like spilling water, kind that meant safety. She kept working. But something in her chest did the thing again, loosening by another small fraction. Counts revealed themselves slowly. Evelyn was good with numbers in the particular way that comes from necessity, rather than natural aptitude. She'd learned to read them, the way she'd learned to read weather, as a survival skill, and that gave her a practical clarity that pure mathematical talent sometimes lacks. She could see what the numbers were, and she could see what they meant, and those were 2 different skills. What she saw in Caleb Whitmore's books over the first 2 weeks told her a coherent story. Ranch was viable. It was not prosperous, but it was sound. The herd was at a reasonable size. Water rights from the creek provided what they needed through dry summers. Acreage was good land. Debt was manageable. If nothing went wrong, Caleb would be stable. But something had been going wrong, slowly, consistently, for about 2 years. She traced it through the numbers carefully, building the picture the way you'd assemble a thing that came in pieces with no instructions. Small fees, some of them legal fees, processing fees, administrative costs she didn't recognize, property assessment from a county office she hadn't heard of, an easement payment listed without an explanation of what the easement covered, water rights registration fees appearing twice in 12 months when they should have appeared once every 3 years. She sat with these numbers for 3 evenings before she said anything. On the 4th evening, she found Caleb in the small office off the main room where he kept the physical documents, and she put the list she'd made in front of him. I need you to explain these, she said. He looked at the list. Jaw did the thing. Some of those are legal, he said slowly. County assessment, the registration fees, those are real. I know they're real payments. What I'm asking is whether you authorized them or whether someone billed you for them and you paid because it was easier than fighting it. The long silence. The water rights registration, he said finally. Got a notice from an office in Helena, said the registration needed renewal. I didn't remember renewing it before. Margaret usually dealt with that kind of paperwork, so I paid it. Easement? He was quiet. A man came out about 18 months ago. Said the county was doing a boundary survey, and there was a question about the eastern boundary of my property, where it meets the Aldous land. Said to clear it up, I'd need to pay for an official easement document. Evelyn waited. About $40. She had known what he was going to say before he said it. Did you check with a lawyer before you paid? Didn't have time. Caleb. She said his name plainly, without softness or sharpness. I think someone has been running a scheme against the ranchers in this area. Fraudulent fees, fake documents, possibly more serious things underneath. This isn't just you, I'd bet there are other ranchers who've received the same notices and paid the same fees. She paused. And I think it may be connected to the Aldous land, which is now sitting empty after Thomas Aldous left, which makes it available for someone to claim. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a person hears something they've already been afraid of, stated plainly for the first time. Roy Vance, Caleb said. It was the first time she'd heard the name. Tell me, she said. Caleb talked for a long time. He was not a man who talked easily, or at length she'd understood that within the first day, so when he did it meant something, and she listened, the way she always listened when something mattered. Completely, without interrupting, tracking not just the words but the sequence of them, the places where he hesitated, the places where his voice changed. Roy Vance was a businessman from Helena who had been moving into the valley for 3 years. He had money, a great deal of it, the origin unclear, and he had connections to county offices and to men who wore suits and carried paperwork and arrived at ranches with official-looking documents in very confident manner. He'd bought 2 ranches already, both from men who'd run into financial trouble that Caleb, now that he was talking, admitted had seemed to come out of nowhere. He had an agent named Dutton who did most of the direct contact, a smooth, well-dressed man who was always polite and always left something slightly wrong in his wake. Dutton had visited the Whitmore Ranch once. Caleb had been out on the range. He'd come back to find Dutton in his yard, talking to Percy, asking questions about the water rights and the eastern boundary in a way that Percy hadn't known enough to find suspicious. What did Dutton say when you came back? Evelyn asked. Said he was doing a survey for a land company. Said they were interested in the area and might be making offers. Said if I ever decided to sell to contact his office. Caleb's voice had gone flat. Very friendly. Did he leave a card? Left a name and a Helena address. I've got it somewhere. He looked at her. You think the fee's the water rights, the easement that was Vance's operation. I think someone is setting you up to look like your land rights are unsettled. Or if there are questions about your eastern boundary, if your water rights can be shown to be improperly registered, if there's debt that can be attached to those questions, it becomes much easier to pressure you to sell, or to find grounds to challenge your ownership legally. She paused. Slow scheme. Careful. The kind of scheme that works because each piece looks like a legitimate inconvenience rather than an attack. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Margaret's father had a saying, he said finally. He was a stubborn old man and usually right about things. He said the most dangerous enemy is the one who makes you feel stupid for noticing them. Your father-in-law sounds like someone I'd have liked. A pause. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent. He would have liked you too, Caleb said. He respected people who paid attention. The question of what to do about Roy Vance was one that Evelyn turned over carefully for several days, because the wrong move would be worse than no move at all. She understood this from experience, not with land fraud, but with the general principle that people in a strong position don't become vulnerable by being powerful. They become vulnerable by overextending. If Vance was running this kind of scheme, he was doing it across multiple properties, probably with the assistance of people in county offices who were either corrupt or careless. That meant there was a paper trail, and paper trails were something Evelyn understood. She needed to see the documents, all of them. Not just Caleb's, she needed to see what he had for the neighboring properties, what the county records showed for the area, whether there were patterns in the fees and the paperwork that pointed to a single source. She also needed a lawyer, which meant she needed to convince Caleb that a lawyer was worth what a lawyer would cost, which was going to require a conversation she wasn't looking forward to. You need someone who can read these documents the way I can read your accounts, she told him one morning. I can see the pattern in the numbers, but I can't tell you whether what's been done is illegal versus irregular versus just unusual. That's a legal question. Lawyers cost money, so does losing your ranch. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her with the particular expression she was starting to recognize as the one where he was deciding whether to be annoyed or whether she was right. Is there someone in Millhaven? She asked. There's a man named Edwin Parrish. Been here about 2 years. Does wills, property disputes, that kind of thing? Caleb paused. I don't know how good he is. I'll tell you after I talk to him. Caleb looked at her. You want to go talk to a lawyer yourself? I want to go to town with Percy on Thursday and introduce myself to Edwin Parrish and see whether he's someone we can work with. She met his eyes steadily. You can come if you'd like, but you don't have to. Pause. I have things to do here Thursday. Then I'll go and tell you what I find. Picked up his coffee cup again. Something in his expression had shifted, not surrender, but something like it. Thing that happens when a person realizes they've been carrying something alone for a long time and someone has quietly come alongside them. Take Percy, he said. The road to town is fine, but the light goes early. I know, she said. I'll be back before dark. Edwin Parrish was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 32, with the slightly starved look of a man building a practice in a small town, but he was sharp. She could tell within the first 5 minutes of setting her list in front of him and watching him read it. He didn't speak while he read. He didn't say things like interesting or the way people did when they were performing attentiveness rather than actually paying it. He simply read, turning the pages she'd brought, and when he was done, he looked up with an expression that was already sorting through implications. Where did you get these? He said. I reorganized the accounts for the Whitmore Ranch, she said. I'm the household manager there. And Whitmore? He's authorized you to come here with this? He knows I'm coming. He doesn't know the exact scope of what I found, because I wanted to understand it better before I brought it to him. He'll be fully informed. Parrish looked at the papers again. Easement payment, he said. The office, this came from the Territorial Land Records Bureau. There's an office by that name in Helena, but it doesn't process individual property easements. Done at the county level. He looked up. This isn't a legitimate document. Evelyn had suspected as much, but hearing it stated plainly by a lawyer was a different thing. Can you prove that? I can write to the county office and confirm it. That'll take 2-3 weeks. But if the answer comes back what I expect it to, then someone has been forging government documents to collect money from ranchers in this valley. He set the papers down carefully. Serious crime, Mrs. Hart. Serious federal crime. I thought it might be. Does Whitmore have other documents from the same source? Possibly. I've only been through 2 years of accounts in detail. I'd need to go back further. Parrish nodded slowly. I want to see everything you find, he said. And I want to contact a colleague in Helena, a man named Graves, who works in land law. This is what I think it is. It's bigger than one ranch. I believe it is, Evelyn said. The Aldous property to the east, the ranch that was abandoned, I think that's connected. Man who owned it left under circumstances I don't fully understand. But his land is now sitting empty. An empty land adjacent to a disputed water source is valuable, Parrish said, very. He looked at her for a moment. You've done this kind of analytical work before, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I've read a lot of accounts, she said. You learn what the numbers are hiding. Parrish gathered the papers carefully and squared them against the table. I'll write to Helena this week, he said. Come back in 2 weeks or sooner if you find more. Mrs. Hart, he paused. Be careful. People who run this kind of scheme don't like to be seen clearly. I understand, she said. She thanked him and went back to the wagon where Percy was waiting with admirable patience. On the way back to the ranch, she sat in the cold and watched the landscape and thought about Roy Vance and about paper trails and about how men who built careful, invisible schemes always left more evidence than they thought they did. Because that was the nature of careful work, it had to be consistent to be effective, and consistency was something you could read, if you knew how. She would know how. The snow came harder that 3rd week. Not yet the serious storm that she could feel gathering somewhere to the north. The hands talked about it among themselves in the way that people who live outdoors talk about weather. With a particular combination of respect and resignation, but enough to change the daily rhythm of the ranch in ways Evelyn was still learning to account for. Animals needed more attention in heavy cold. The water troughs froze overnight and had to be broken up in the mornings. The supply of firewood was adequate, but not generous, and she added that to the list of things that needed to be addressed before January arrived in earnest. She was in the middle of that particular calculation one afternoon when she heard raised voices from the yard. Not fighting voices more, the voices of men disagreeing about something practical, which was a different sound. She went to the window. Caleb and Holt were standing near the barn, and whatever they were discussing had both of them gesturing in the direction of the east pasture. She watched for a moment, then went back to her numbers. Not her business until it was. It became her business about an hour later when Caleb came inside with snow on his boots and a look on his face that she was learning to read as the precursor to him, saying something he'd been working up to for a while. How much do you know about cattle in a freeze, he said. I grew up on a farm, not cattle, mostly hogs and some milk cows. Principles are similar in cold weather. Holt says we might have a problem with the east herd. Creek's been rising snowmelt from further up. Probably, and if it goes over the bank near the east pasture, we could have cattle standing in ice water overnight. He looked at her steadily. We've got enough men probably, but not with margin. How many hands will you take? All of them. I was going to have Sam stay here to watch the house and the outbuildings, but I can watch the house, Evelyn said. He paused. It's not watching the house I'm thinking about. She waited. If the storm comes at the same time the creek goes over, if we have both happening at once, we're going to be moving cattle in the dark and the cold with not enough hands. And some of them are going to go the wrong way, and someone's going to have to. He stopped. I'm not trying to suggest you should. You need someone who can ride, Evelyn said. Pause. Can ride? She said it plainly because it was plain. I'm not a range hand, and I won't pretend otherwise. I can stay on a horse in bad weather, and I can move animals if someone tells me where they need to go. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she could see him working through the thing he didn't want to say, the part about her being a woman, about Lily needing her, about all the reasons this was an unreasonable thing to ask. I'm not asking you, he said finally. I want to be clear. If it comes to it, it'll be your choice. I know, she said. Thank you for telling me so I can make it. He nodded once slowly and went back outside. Evelyn stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed, listening to the wind find the gaps around the windows, thinking about what came next. Afraid, exactly. Something more complicated than afraid. She thought about Gerald Potts, about the casual contempt in the way he'd thrown her suitcase into the mud. She thought about Holt's careful, thorough look on the first day. She thought about Parrish and about paper trails and about Roy Vance, who was somewhere she couldn't see yet, doing things she could almost but not quite prove. She thought about Lily, sound asleep at this hour in her room, comfortable and warm and unsuspecting. She was going to need to fix all of it. The ranch, the accounts, the scheme being run against this land and the people on it. She was going to need to be steady enough and smart enough, and if the storm came, when the creek rose and they were short-handed brave enough to do whatever the moment asked of her. She was not afraid of any of those things, she realized. Tired sometimes. She was lonely, in the specific way of someone who is surrounded by people and still fundamentally alone, because none of these people yet knew her well enough to be company against the kind of quiet she carried. She was not afraid. She put her coat on and went out to help break the ice off the water troughs, because that was what needed to be done right now. And doing what needed to be done right now was how you earned the right to do what needed to be done later. Creek went over its bank on a Thursday. Evelyn knew before anyone told her. She'd been watching the water level every morning since Caleb mentioned it, a habit she'd formed without quite deciding to form it. The way you develop habits around things that worry you. Each morning she walked to the kitchen window first thing and looked east toward the line of willows that marked the creek's edge, checking the dark water against the pale bank. For 4 days it had been rising steadily, maybe 2 inches a day, the snowmelt from the mountains coming down in the slow, relentless way of things that have decided where they're going, regardless of what's in the way. On Thursday morning she looked east, and the willows were standing in water. She didn't wait for Caleb to notice. She put on her coat over her nightgown, pulled on her boots without lacing them properly, and went and knocked on his door. He opened it faster than she expected, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. I know, he said before she could speak. He was already dressed. Next 20 minutes had the quality of organized emergency, that particular atmosphere of people who know what's wrong and are moving to address it with the controlled urgency of experience. Caleb woke the hands. Holt was already up, had apparently been up for an hour, standing in the yard in the pre-dawn dark with a lantern and an expression that said he'd been waiting for the rest of them to catch up. Sam had the horses out of the barn and was checking tack by feel in the poor light. Percy was pulling on his second boot while simultaneously trying to eat something, which was not going well. East herd's in the lower pasture, Holt said to Caleb, without preamble. 40 head. Creek comes up another 6 inches. They'll be standing in it. Temperature drops tonight the way it's supposed to. Anything in that water long enough is going to start losing toes. We need them moved to the upper pasture, Caleb said. I know where they need to go. Holt said it without heat. Just a fact. Question is whether we've got enough men to move them before the weather comes in. Everyone looked at the sky without meaning to. It was that particular winter sky that people who live in cold places learn to read not yet storming, but the color of something thinking about it. The flat gray that started close and went on for miles in every direction, with no quality of light that suggested the sun intended to be useful today. I'll ride, Evelyn said. It was not the first time she'd said it. She'd said it to Caleb 2 days ago. She was saying it now, in front of all of them, which was different. And she knew it was different. And she said it anyway. Holt looked at her. The same thorough look as the first day, but something had changed in it, not warmth exactly, but an absence of the prior skepticism. Seen her on the roof. He'd seen her at the account books. He'd watched her move through this ranch for 3 weeks without complaint and without pretense. Said, "You can ride," he said. "I can ride. In weather like this, moving cattle, it's not like riding in a field." "I know what it is." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm not telling you I'm a range hand. I'm telling you I can stay on a horse and follow directions and do what's needed." A pause. Holt looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Evelyn. "Lily," he said, I'll ask Sam to stay near the house." She'd been about to say Mrs. Finch, forgetting for a moment where she was. Sam knows the child. She trusts him. Sam, who had been standing quietly with the horses, said, "I can do that with the straightforward ease of a man who doesn't object to being asked to do useful things." Holt was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up a saddle from the fence rail and walked toward the barn without further discussion. Evelyn took that as yes. She had told Caleb she could ride, and this was true, but she had not specified under what conditions she had last ridden, which was 4 years ago on a placid mare on flat Ohio farmland in July. She was aware, as she mounted the horse Holt selected for her, a compact gray gelding named Trace that Holt described as sensible, which turned out to be the highest possible compliment that there was a meaningful gap between what she'd done before and what she was about to do. Cold hit her the moment they moved out of the shelter of the buildings. Yeah, not the ordinary cold of the morning she'd spent in the yard, but something with an intention to it, the kind of cold that moves through clothing and addresses itself to you specifically. She didn't say anything about it. She pulled her scarf higher and concentrated on the horse. Trace was, in fact, sensible. He moved with a steadiness that Evelyn suspected was the product of years of working in exactly this kind of situation, and she found that if she stopped thinking about riding and simply sat with him, let him manage the footing, her body remembered enough to stay upright. Muscle memory was a strange thing you forgot you had it until the moment you needed it. Reached the east pasture in about 20 minutes. Cattle were visible from a distance, a dark mass against the pale field, moving with the restless unease of animals that know something is wrong and haven't decided what to do about it yet. Creak was audible before they could see it clearly. A sound that was fuller and more insistent than Evelyn had heard it before. The sound of water that has exceeded its expected boundaries and is still moving. It's over the bank in 2 places, Holt called to Caleb, from the far edge of the pasture where he'd ridden ahead. East corner and the low point by the willows. The cattle have been avoiding it, but they're starting to push toward it. They don't like the feel of the ground. Evelyn understood this. Animals move toward water when stressed, even water that was wrong. It was the instinct overriding the assessment. "We need to push them north before they decide to go east," Caleb said, scanning the herd, counting. "Percy, take the far end." Holt, left flank. "Mrs. Hart," he looked at her. "You stay near me, center. Something breaks away, follow my direction." "Yes," she said. And then there was no more talking because the work began. Moving 40 head of cattle in the dark, and the cold, with 5 people and rising water behind them, was not a thing that could be described, Evelyn thought, in any way that conveyed what it actually was. She had read about cattle drives. She had a general understanding of the principal pressure from behind, and the sides, control the flanks, keep them moving forward, and don't let the leaders stop, because the rest would pile into them, and confusion would spread like fire through dry grass. What she had not understood, from reading and general understanding, was the noise. Cattle were not simply large, they were large and afraid, and communicating that fear to each other in a constant low bellowing that seemed to come from everywhere at once and bypass the ears and register directly in the chest. Ground was churned mud and ice in equal measure, and the horses were picking their footing carefully, and the thin, grudging light of a December morning under a closed sky gave everything a flat gray quality that made distances deceptive. Stayed near Caleb. She did not try to do more than she could do, which was perhaps the most important decision she made in the first 20 minutes. When a cow broke left, she saw it, but she also saw that Holt was already moving, and she held Trace steady and let Holt handle it, because 2 horses converging on one animal from 2 directions was not better than 1 horse doing it right. She watched how they moved, their hands, how they used the horses, how they communicated with gestures and calls across the noise. She filed it away and adapted. Caleb glanced at her twice in the first 20 minutes. She didn't know what he was looking for. She kept her attention on the cattle. About 40 minutes in, the weather changed. It didn't start slowly, the way weather changes in mild climates. It arrived. One moment the air was sharp and still, and the next there was wind, and the wind had snow in it, and the snow had the particular horizontal quality of serious blizzard rather than ordinary snowfall. Temperature dropped in what felt like seconds. "Storm's here," Percy shouted from the far end unnecessarily. Cattle felt it immediately. The whole mass shifted with a collective anxiety that moved through them like water, and the leaders, which had been moving tolerably toward the upper pasture, suddenly stopped, and the ones behind pressed into them, and the whole thing started to compress and turn. "Going to scatter," Holt called. "I see it," Caleb called back. He wheeled his horse and pushed forward along the left side of the herd, and Holt went right. And the effect was to create a moving wall that pressed the cattle forward again. But the leaders were still resisting, and there were animals at the back starting to peel away toward the east, toward the sound of the swollen creek, which, in some terrible cattle logic, sounded like water and therefore safety. Evelyn saw the two that broke right before Caleb did. Lee. She saw them because she'd been watching the back of the herd rather than the front, which was where the current crisis was, because someone needed to watch the back, and everyone else was managing the front. Two young steers, pushing through the flank of the herd with the determined stupidity of animals that have made a decision and are committed to it. They were heading east, toward the creek. She didn't think about it. Turned Trace and went after them. Trace understood what she wanted before she'd fully figured out how to ask for it. He moved into a canter on the frozen ground with the sure-footed confidence of an experienced working horse. Aunt Evelyn crouched forward and held on and stopped thinking about whether she could do this and simply did it. She got ahead of the steers in about 30 seconds further than she'd expected. They'd moved faster than she'd thought, and she turned Trace broadside to them, which was something she'd watched Holt do twice. Gand made noise. She didn't have a rope, and she didn't have a full understanding of what she was doing. She was on a horse, and the horse was between the steers and the creek, and she was shouting, and Trace was moving with short, quick steps that kept him in their way. Steers stopped. They looked at her with the particular bovine expression of animals encountering an obstacle and reassessing. She held Trace in place and kept making noise, and slowly, in the way of animals that have not fully committed to being stupid, the steers began to move back the way they'd come. She pushed them back to the herd. By the time she rejoined the others, the leaders had broken through and were moving north again, the rest following with the momentum of a mass that had finally decided where it was going. The snow was driving hard and horizontal, and she couldn't see more than 30 feet in any direction, but she could hear the cattle moving, and she could see Caleb's shape in the gray murk, and she followed both. It took another hour to get the herd to the upper pasture. An hour of snow and cold and noise, and the specific physical effort of staying on a horse through rough terrain and bad weather, when your hands were going numb and your face was doing the same, and you were running entirely on the part of self that doesn't stop until the work is finished. When the last animal moved through the gate and Percy closed it behind them, everyone stopped. For about 15 seconds, nobody said anything. They just sat there in the blizzard, the 5 of them and their horses, in the specific silence of people who have just finished doing something that required all of them. Then Holt said, "That'll hold," and Caleb looked at Evelyn. She was aware suddenly of how cold she was, of the way her hands felt, which was not good, of the fact that her coat was wet through on the left side where the wind had been driving the snow against her for an hour. "2 in the back," Caleb said. "I saw you go after them. They were heading for the creek. I know where they were heading." He was looking at her with the expression she hadn't seen from him before, not the professional assessment, not the tight-jawed calculation. Something more direct, something that had been unguarded by the cold and the urgency and an hour of working in the same space with not enough attention to spare for managing expressions. "Did it right," he said. "I watched Holt." From somewhere in the gray murk of snow, Holt's voice said, "You watched good." She decided not to say anything else about it. She turned Trace toward home and followed the sound of the others through the blizzard. She concentrated on her hands and on staying on the horse. She did not think about what Caleb's expression had meant, what it might mean later. Right now she was cold and tired, and there was a 5-year-old waiting at the house, and that was what mattered. Came back to the ranch to find Lily asleep in front of the fireplace. Sam had arranged this with the particular competence of a man who understood children better than he advertised. He'd apparently told Lily a very long story about a horse that could count to 10. Let her ask every possible follow-up question about this horse, and by the time the story wound its way to a conclusion, she'd been unconscious for 20 minutes, with her head on a folded blanket Sam had put there in advance. He reported this to Evelyn with quiet satisfaction when she came in. She never asked where I was? Evelyn said. She asked once around the middle. I told her you were doing important ranch work. She said like Mama does and went back to listening about the horse. Evelyn looked at her daughter's sleeping face. The complete, total relaxation of a child who is certain she is safe. Something about that. Something about Lily not being afraid, even while Evelyn was out in a blizzard chasing cattle through the dark, loosened the last of the tension she'd been holding across her shoulders for the past 2 hours. Thank you, she said to Sam. She's a good kid, he said. Easy to be kind to. The hands went to the bunkhouse to get warm and dry. Evelyn changed her clothes and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table while the storm drove snow against the windows and the house made the small sounds it made when the temperature dropped the creak of wood, the whisper of wind in the eaves. Caleb came in from checking the horses about an hour after they'd returned, stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand, and looked at her at the table and didn't immediately say anything. Coffee's fresh, she said. He came in and sat down. Poured a cup. He drank half of it. I owe you an apology, he said. She looked up. For what? Not for the way I've been treating what you've found in the accounts. Vance business. He set the cup down. He looked at the table rather than at her. I've known something was wrong for a year. I knew the fees were off, knew the easement felt wrong.
Pause.
I kept thinking it was something I could deal with later, something that would resolve itself, or that I was imagining it. You weren't imagining it, no. He looked up. Perish what he said about the documents being fraudulent. That's real, it's real. A silence. The fire popped. Outside, the storm was building toward something, the wind finding its full register. Had a man offer to buy this ranch in September, Caleb said. Dutton, Vance's man. He said it without looking away, which she understood was costing him something. The offer was low. Too low, like he knew things were going to get difficult for me. He paused. I told him no. He was very pleasant about it. Said the offer would stand if I changed my mind. Expects you to change your mind. He expects me to run out of options. Caleb turned the coffee cup in his hands. Those fees, if they can get the land rights challenged, if there's a legal question about the water from the creek. He stopped. A ranch without secure water rights in this territory is worth about half what it should be. Maybe less. He's trying to make me worth half of what I am. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She'd known this from the numbers. Hearing him say it, hearing the specific weight of it in his voice, the thing it meant to a man who'd built this place and worked this land and buried his wife here made it different. He's not going to get it, she said. It came out with more certainty than she'd planned. Not a performance, it was simply what she believed, said plainly. Caleb looked at her. How sure are you? Very. She set down her own cup. He's left a paper trail. Every fake fee, every fraudulent document, every payment he extracted from ranchers in this area, it's there. He had to make it look real enough to work, which means he had to create documents, and documents leave traces. Parrish is writing to Helena. When the county confirms that easement office doesn't exist, we'll have proof of fraud. She paused. What I need from you is access to everything, not just the last 2 years. Everything you have, going back as far as you've got records. And I need you to ask the other ranchers around here quietly, carefully, whether they've received the same kinds of notices. Holt knows the Brennan brothers to the south, Caleb said slowly. And I know Martin Greeley over toward Jasper Creek. Talk to them. Don't tell them everything yet. Just ask if they've had any unusual fee notices or property questions in the past 2 or 3 years. Let me see the pattern. He nodded. He was looking at her with that unguarded expression again, the one she'd seen in the storm field, in the brief moment between finishing the work and putting everything back in its proper place. Can I ask you something, he said. Yes. Why are you doing this? He said it without accusation, without suspicion. Just the plain question. You came here for a job. House management. Accounts. This he gestured in a way that took in the evidence. The lawyer. All of it. This is more than the job. She considered the question honestly. Because it matters, she said. This ranch is real. What's being done to it is wrong. I have the skills to help, and I'm in a position to use them. She paused. She stopped. Because? He was waiting. She looked at the table. Because I need this to work, she said. Not just for the wages. She paused, trying to find the precise words rather than the easy ones. I need to be somewhere that's real, where the work I do makes a real difference to real people. I have been existing at the edge of other people's lives for 2 years, and I need to matter somewhere. She looked up. That's probably more than you asked for. He was quiet. No, he said finally. That's the right answer. A silence that was different from the earlier ones, not uncomfortable, but fuller, like a room that has gained a piece of furniture that was missing and makes the whole space make more sense. Get some sleep, Evelyn said. The storm's going to be at its worst by morning, and you'll need to check the herd at first light. Stood, picked up his hat, moved toward the door, then stopped. What you did out there tonight, he said without turning around. 2 steers. It worked, she said. That's all. That's not all. He did turn then briefly. I've had men on this ranch who wouldn't have done what you did. Just stopped, nodded once. Good night, Mrs. Hart. Good night, Mr. Whitmore, she said. She sat in the kitchen after he was gone and listened to the storm and let herself very carefully and very briefly feel something other than managed. Something uncertain and warm and slightly frightening, the way things feel when they start to become real. Then she put it away and went to check on Lily. The storm lasted 3 days. The first day was brutal, the kind of sustained blizzard that changed the shape of things, piling drifts against the buildings that had to be dug out every morning before the doors could open, dropping temperatures low enough that the horse's breath made clouds even inside the barn. Caleb and the hands worked in shifts, checking the animals, breaking ice, keeping the paths clear. Evelyn ran the house at full capacity, keeping food ready at irregular hours because the men came in when they could, keeping the fires stoked, drying wet gear by the heat and having it ready again. Lily, who found the whole situation extremely interesting, spent the storm hours at the window with a running commentary. Percy fell down, she reported on the second morning. Is he hurt? Evelyn asked, without looking up from the pot she was stirring. Got up. He's doing the face he makes when he's pretending he didn't fall. Good, a pause. Stay away from the window, Lily. Cold comes through the glass. I have my blanket. Lily. Lily retreated from the window. Approximately 4 minutes later, she was at the window again. Evelyn let it go. Some battles mattered more than others. On the second day, when the worst of the storm had passed its peak and the wind had reduced from a sustained assault to a more ordinary anger, Evelyn managed to get into the small office where Caleb kept the older records. He'd given her a key before the storm, and she'd been waiting for a stretch of hours when her presence wasn't needed in the kitchen. She found what she was looking for in the records from 4 years back. It was a land survey document, old, professionally done, the kind that established property lines with precision, covered the Whitmore Ranch and the adjacent properties, and it showed, in careful detail, where the creek ran, what it watered, and who held rights to it. There was something else, a smaller notation, in the margin of the 3rd page, in handwriting she didn't recognize. Reference to a parcel of land 14 acres, it said, along the eastern boundary, and beside it, a name. Her name, not Evelyn Hart, but a name she recognized nonetheless, because it was on documents she carried in her suitcase that she hadn't flirted through, yet documents from her father's estate that she'd packed almost by habit when she left Ohio, thinking they were of no more than sentimental value. Eleanor M. Cavett, her mother's maiden name, her mother who had grown up in this territory before moving east. Her mother, who had never talked about the land she'd left behind. Her mother, who had died when Evelyn was 12 and taken whatever she hadn't talked about with her. Evelyn sat on the floor of the small office with a survey document in her hands and the storm pressing against the windows and something enormous moving through her that she had no immediate name for. 14 acres. Her mother's this valley. She sat with it for a long time, long enough for the light to change. Then she folded the survey document carefully, tucked it inside her coat next to the photograph of Robert, and went back to the kitchen because supper needed to be started and the men would be cold and hungry when they came in. She would think about this later. She would figure out what it meant and whether it was what she thought it was and what could be done about it. For now there was work. On the 3rd day of the storm, Dutton came. She didn't know who he was at first. He arrived in the early afternoon when the snow had slowed enough to see more than 20 feet, a man on a very good horse wearing a coat that was too fine for the weather and the road, picking his way along the approach to the ranch with the careful bearing of someone who was accustomed to arriving at places and being received. She saw him from the kitchen window. Caleb was in the barn. She went to the door before Dutton reached the porch. He was perhaps 40, clean-shaved, with a face that was pleasant in a studied way, the pleasantness of a man who developed it as a professional tool rather than a natural expression. Took off his hat when he saw her, which was practiced courtesy. Good afternoon, he said. I'm looking for Caleb Whitmore. My name is Dutton. Everything in Evelyn became very still. She kept her face exactly where it was neutral, polite, mildly quizzical. "Mr. Whitmore is occupied at the moment," she said. "Can I help you?" He looked at her with the frank assessment of a man who was deciding whether she was worth his time. "I have business with him," he said. "I don't mind waiting." "Of course." She stepped back from the door. "Please come in." Brought him into the main room. She brought him coffee. Sat across from him, and was pleasant and entirely unrevealing, and asked him how the roads were, and whether the storm had been difficult coming up from wherever he'd come from. She listened to his answers, and watched his hands and filed everything, trying to assess her. She could feel it, the careful questions wrapped in ordinary conversation, the way he glanced around the room, the way he asked about how long she'd been at the ranch, and what her role was, with a pleasantness that was performing neutrality while actually gathering information. He was good at it. She gave him very little. When Caleb came in, she'd sent Percy to the barn. One quiet word while Dutton's attention was briefly elsewhere. He stopped in the doorway for a fraction of a second. When he saw who was in his main room, Evelyn watched his jaw do the thing and watched him control it. "Dutton," Caleb said. "Flat and even, Mr. Whitmore." Dutton stood, extended his hand. Caleb shook it. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I was in the area and wanted to check in. It's been some months." "Has," Caleb agreed. He sat down. He didn't ask Evelyn to leave. Guy. She noted this, and took up a piece of mending she'd left on the side table, which was something a person did when they were simply present in a room rather than listening. "I wanted to revisit our previous conversation," Dutton said. His voice had the particular quality of a man who has done this many times, the ease of someone delivering a practiced speech in the register of spontaneous conversation. "The land market has shifted some since September. Mr. Vance's company has expanded its interests in this valley and is prepared to improve its previous offer. I told you in September I wasn't interested in selling," Caleb said. "Of course, and I respect that entirely." A smile. "Practiced warmth of it, but circumstances change. The winter's been hard. And I'm aware there are some questions around the Eastern Boundary Survey discrepancies, I think. Some questions about the water rights registration. These things can become complicated and expensive to resolve." The smile held its warmth. "Your improved offer might make more sense than a lengthy legal process." Evelyn put a small, neat stitch in the shirt she was mending. "Kind of offer?" Caleb said. She kept her eyes on the mending. She heard Dutton quote a number. She heard Caleb's silence. "That's below market," Caleb said. "Given the legal uncertainties, it's a fair price. You'd walk away clear of the complications." "What complications specifically?" "Eastern Boundary Survey. The water rights registration question." Dutton paused. "I understand there may also be some debt questions fees related to land administration. These things accumulate." Evelyn put another stitch in the shirt. Needle went through the fabric with a small, precise sound. "A water rights registration fee," Caleb said. "The one I paid last year to the Territorial Land Records Bureau." "Yes. Parish tells me that office doesn't process individual water rights registrations." Silence. Not long, half a second maybe, but in that half second, she heard the practiced ease in Dutton's voice do something it hadn't done before. Tiny recalibration. "Parish, Edwin Parish, the lawyer in Millhaven." Caleb said it without emphasis. He's been looking at some of the documents I've received over the past 2 years, finding some interesting things." Another silence. Longer this time. Evelyn finished the stitch she was on and started another. "Mr. Whitmore," Dutton said, and the pleasantness was still there, but thinner now, like paint going on a second coat over a wall that wasn't fully prepared. "I understand there can be concerns about the paperwork involved in land administration. These are often innocent discrepancies, bureaucratic complexity, different offices with overlapping jurisdictions. Man forged a government document to take $40 from me," Caleb said. "That's not bureaucratic complexity." The silence that followed was of a completely different quality from all the previous ones. Dutton stood up. He picked up his hat from where he'd placed it on the arm of the chair. His face had settled into something that had stopped pretending to be pleasant without quite becoming anything else. "I'll let Mr. Vance know you're not interested," he said. "You do that," Caleb said. Dutton looked at Evelyn then just briefly, a glance that might have meant anything, or might have been entirely calculated. She looked back at him over her mending with the expression of a woman whose attention had been elsewhere and had been politely recalled. Left. The sound of his horse moving away from the ranch was audible through the window for almost a minute, getting smaller, and then the storm noise swallowed it. Caleb sat in his chair with his hands on his knees and looked at the fire. He'll go back to Vance, Evelyn said. She set down the mending.
Yes.
And Vance will know that you're looking at the documents.
Yes.
Which means we have less time than we thought. She stood. I need to write to Parrish tonight, before the road's clear. I need him to accelerate the Helena inquiry. She paused. Caleb, there's something else. Something I found in the records yesterday. In the old survey. He turned to look at her. There's a land notation in the Eastern Boundary Survey, she said. 14 acres. The name attached to it, she stopped. Steadied herself. The name is my mother's. She grew up in this territory. She left before I was born, and she never talked about it. And I don't know what it means yet, but if there's a valid land claim in that name, would be yours, Caleb said. If you can prove the connection.
Yes.
She met his eyes, and it would be adjacent to your eastern boundary. D, which means whoever wants to challenge your water rights would also have to get through a legitimate competing claim on that same boundary. The fire crackled. The storm pressed against the windows. Evelyn, Caleb said. It was the first time he'd used her first name. He said it as though he'd been deciding to for a while. I know, she said. I know what it might mean. She picked up her mending again, then put it back down because her hands weren't quite steady. One thing at a time. Tonight I write to Parrish. Tomorrow you talk to Holt about the Brennan brothers. And I need to find the documents from my father's estate, the ones I brought from Ohio, without knowing why. I'll get you a lamp for the office, Caleb said. Thank you. Went to get the lamp. She stood in the main room with the fire and the storm outside, and her mother's name in a margin of a 40-year-old survey in her coat pocket. And she thought about the way things connect across time, the decisions people make, and leave behind like furniture in an empty house, waiting for someone to come along and recognize what they are. She had come to Millhaven with a broken suitcase and nowhere to go. She had not yet begun to understand what she'd actually come to find. The letter from Helena arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Parrish had sent his inquiry. Evelyn knew it was important before she opened it, which was not intuition so much as pattern recognition. Parrish had sent word the previous day that something was coming. Brief note delivered by a boy from town who found her in the yard and handed it over with the solemnity of someone who understood he was carrying something that mattered. Note said only, response from the county office expected tomorrow. Come when you can. She went the next morning. Percy drove her. Roads had cleared enough after the storm to be passable, though the drifts on either side were still chest-high in places, and the sky had the pale, exhausted look of winter that has spent itself and hasn't yet decided what to do next. Parrish was at his desk when she arrived, and the letter was open in front of him, and his expression told her everything before he said a word. Sit down, he said. She sat. The Territorial Land Records Bureau, he said. The office that sent Whitmore the water rights registration notice. The county clerk in Helena has confirmed that no such office exists in the territorial government. Never has. He paused. The letter had the official seal on the document, the signature all fabricated. Someone printed official-looking documents, mailed them to ranchers in this valley, collected the fees, and there is no legitimate record of any of it. Evelyn had known this was coming. She had traced it through the numbers herself, had laid out the logic for Parrish in their first meeting, had told Caleb what she believed was true. But there was a difference, she found, between believing something and having it confirmed, between the private certainty of your own reasoning and the moment it becomes a fact that other people can hold. How many ranchers? She asked. Parrish turned the letter over. Helena office is still investigating, but they've identified at least 6 properties in this valley that received similar notices over the past 3 years. Total collected that they can document so far is somewhere above $400. He looked up. That's only what they can document. The real number is probably higher. Dutton was here, Evelyn said, 3 days after the storm. Came to make an improved offer on the ranch. Parrish's expression sharpened. What did Whitmore say? He told him Parrish was looking at the documents. Dutton left. They know we're moving. Parrish set the letter down and pressed his hands flat on the desk, the gesture of a man organizing his thinking into something he can act on. That changes the timeline. If Vance thinks a legal challenge is coming, he may try to file something preemptive, challenge the land title before we can establish the fraud. He paused. Does Whitmore have his original deed? Everything from when he acquired the property? I found it in the records 2 days ago. It's complete. Good. Bring it when you come next. He looked at her steadily. Run the other matter, the land notation with your mother's name. Have you found the documents from your father's estate? This was the thing she'd been sitting with for 3 weeks, turning over at night, after Lily was asleep. approaching carefully from different angles, the way you approach something you're afraid of misreading. I found them, she said. She reached into her coat and produced the papers she'd folded and carried for the past 10 days. Her father's estate documents, brought from Ohio as an afterthought, as sentiment. 3 pages, handwritten by a solicitor in Columbus, describing the disposition of property belonging to the estate of James Cavett. There, on the second page, a notation about land in Montana Territory, 14 acres along a creek boundary, surveyed and registered in the name of Eleanor Marie Cavett in 1861, never formally transferred, never claimed, not included in the estate disposition because the solicitor in Columbus had apparently not known to look for it or had not found it in time. Unclaimed land, 14 acres, her mother's name. Parrish read the pages with the same silent focus he always brought to documents. When he finished, he read them again. Then he set them down and looked at Evelyn. These are legitimate, he said. And the county survey matches the notation in the Whitmore, records this is a valid, unresolved land claim. Your mother registered this property. It was never transferred, never formally released. Passed as part of her estate at her death. He paused. To her heirs. To me, Evelyn said. If you can prove the line of inheritance, yes. She'd been holding herself very still since she sat down. Something in her chest was doing a complicated thing she didn't entirely trust herself to manage in a lawyer's office. So she kept her hands in her lap and her face level and let Parrish finish. 14 acres, he said. Where exactly do they sit? Along the eastern boundary of the Whitmore property, she said. Adjacent to the Aldous land. Parrish was quiet for a moment. The Aldous land that's now sitting empty, he said. The land that Vance's operation has been targeting as part of the eastern boundary dispute. Yes, another pause. He picked up his pen and set it down again without writing anything. Mrs. Hart, he said, if you file a claim on those 14 acres, and we simultaneously challenge the fraudulent fees and the boundary manipulation Vance has been orchestrating those two things together, create a legal position that makes the eastern boundary of the Whitmore property essentially unassailable. Any challenge Vance tries to bring would have to get through a competing legitimate claim first. He looked at her. That's not a small thing. I know, she said. Filing a claim will also make you visible. To Vance, to Dutton. It will make clear that someone has been looking at the documents and knows what they found. I'm already visible, she said. Dutton saw me. Parrish nodded slowly. I'll need everything you have. The estate papers, proof of your connection to Eleanor Cavett, the survey notation. I'll also need to write to a land office colleague in Helena, a man named Graves. I mentioned him before. This has gotten large enough that I want someone with more experience in territorial land law involved. He gathered the papers carefully. This will take time, Mrs. Hart. Possibly months. I know that too, she said. But Vance doesn't know what we have. Every week Parrish gives us is another week to build the case. She stood. What do you need from me today? Write out everything you've found in the accounts. Dates, amounts, office names, all of it. Pattern you identified. He held her eyes. You can read numbers the way I read law. I need that in writing. She nodded. I'll have it to you by Friday. On the ride back to the ranch, Percy asked, with the careful indirectness of someone who's been trying to figure out whether a question is his business, whether things were going to be all right. She looked at him. He was keeping his eyes on the road, his jaw set in the way young men set their jaws when they're trying to look unconcerned about something they're actually very concerned about. This ranch matters to you, she said. Percy was quiet for a moment. Been here 4 years, he said. First job I had that, he stopped. Started again. Mr. Whitmore's a fair man. There aren't as many of those as there should be. No, she agreed. There aren't. Another stretch of quiet road, the horses breathing clouds in the cold. Things are going to be difficult for a while, she said. Yes, I think it will be all right. She paused. I intend to make sure of it. Percy nodded. He seemed to find this satisfactory. He clicked his tongue at the horses, and they moved a little faster, and neither of them said anything else for the rest of the ride. She gave Caleb the full account that evening. She laid it out the way she laid out everything in order, with the evidence attached to each point, without dramatizing what didn't need dramatizing, because the facts themselves were dramatic enough. Confirmed fraud, the 6 documented ranchers, the $400 and more, Parrish and the colleague in Helena, and then last, the land claim. Caleb listened to all of it without interrupting. This was one of the things she'd come to rely on in him, his capacity to listen without performing his reaction while he was still in the middle of forming it. When she finished, He was quiet for a long moment. 14 acres, he said. Your mother grew up here. Somewhere in this valley, yes. I don't have the specifics. She never talked about it. Evelyn looked at the table. She left when she was young, I know that much. She went east and met my father and married him and stayed. She had a sister, I think, but there was some falling out and they lost contact. That's all I know. Did she ever say why she left? No, a pause. She died when I was 12. I didn't know the right questions to ask yet. Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. The eastern boundary, if your claim holds it, sits right where Dutton was asking about. Right where the survey question was raised. Exactly where. She looked up at him. The claim is legitimate, which Parrish believes it is. Then the land Vance's operation has been trying to destabilize as a pressure point against you has a competing legitimate owner. One who is not going to sell. He looked at her steadily. Be staying, he said. It was not precisely a question. Nah, it had the quality of something being said aloud that had previously existed only as an understood thing between two people who had not yet gotten around to saying it. I'd be staying, she said. A silence that was neither uncomfortable nor entirely comfortable, something more honest than either. Good, Caleb said. 3 days later, Holt came to her. She was in the office working on the written account. Parrish had asked for pages of dates and amounts and office names, the full pattern laid out in the clear, unglamorous language of someone who wants the truth to be visible rather than impressive when she heard his knock at the doorframe. He stood there with his hat in his hand, which was how she'd learned. He indicated he wanted to talk seriously. Brennan brothers, he said. I talked to them yesterday over at their southern fence line. She set down her pen. And they had 2 notices. He said it flatly, the way he said everything. But there was something underneath the flatness. One come from the same office as Whitmore's water rights fee. One from a different office name, something about a grazing rights assessment, but the same story. Official-looking letter, specific amount, pay to keep your records clear. He turned his hat slowly in his hands. Paid both. How much? About $60 total. He paused. Not doing well, the Brennans. $60 was significant. Evelyn thought about what $60 meant to a struggling ranch in winter. Did they keep the documents? One of them. Evan Brennan, the younger one, he kept everything. In case it ever needed sorting out, he said. Holt's voice had something in it that might have been respect, or might have been something sadder. He knew it felt wrong. He just didn't know what to do about it. He does now, Evelyn said. Tell him Parrish needs to see those documents. Tell him it's not just him, there are at least 6 ranches and probably more. She paused. Tell him he wasn't foolish for paying. He was being deceived by people who were specifically good at deceiving. Holt was quiet for a moment. He turned his hat one more time. Greeley, too, he said. Whitmore spoke to Martin Greeley over toward Jasper Creek. Same story. He got a property line assessment notice, paid it. $45. Evelyn picked up her pen and added 2 more entries to the list. Holt, she said. He looked up from his hat. You've been on this ranch 12 years, she said. You know these people. The Brennans, Greeley, the others in this valley. When this is over, when the legal case is built, and Vance's operation is exposed, these people are going to need to know what happened to them. Going to need to understand it clearly so they can protect themselves in the future. She met his eyes. You're the person they'll listen to. Not me, not Parrish. You. He looked at her for a long moment. You've got a way of giving people their job to do, he said. It wasn't a complaint. I learned it from someone who didn't know he was teaching me, she said. She didn't specify who. It was her father. Actually a man who had organized farm labor not by issuing orders but by saying out loud plainly what needed to be done and who was best suited to do it, then getting out of the way. She'd watched him do it for years before she understood what she was watching. Holt put his hat back on. I'll talk to Evan Brennan, he said, and I'll let Greeley know about Parrish. Thank you, she said. Left. She went back to the account she was writing and added the Brennan and Greeley entries in her clear handwriting, and the list grew by another page. Response from Helena came in 2 parts. The first part arrived via Parrish in mid-January, a letter from his colleague Graves, who had looked at the documents Parrish sent and confirmed not just the fraud on the water rights registration, but something larger, a pattern across several counties in the territory, using at least 4 different fictional office names, all traced through document analysis to a single printing operation in Helena that had also produced materials for 2 other schemes in the past 5 years, both of which had collapsed before anyone identified the source. The scheme had a name in the legal correspondence. It was called by the investigators a land pressuring operation, a pattern of manufactured legal uncertainty applied to properties that a buyer wanted to acquire at below market prices. Create the uncertainty. Collect fees to make the uncertainty look administrative rather than fraudulent. Wait for the owners to run out of money or patience or both. Move in with an offer when they were vulnerable. Roy Vance was named in the letter as the primary beneficiary of the scheme in this valley. Dutton was named as the agent. 2 officials in a county office in Helena were named as having received payments in exchange for allowing the fictional office names to be registered in ways that made the letterhead look legitimate on initial inspection. Evelyn read the letter twice at Parrish's desk, slowly then handed it back. Graves wants to come here, Parrish said. He wants to take statements from the ranchers directly. He believes there's enough to bring a federal fraud case. When? He can be here in 2 weeks if the roads hold. Parrish paused. Something else. The Aldous property, the ranch that was abandoned before you arrived. Graves's investigation found that Thomas Aldous received the same kind of pressure over an 8-month period, significantly more aggressive than what was applied to Whitmore and the others. He set the letter down. Aldous had debts that were real, not manufactured, and Vance's operation identified those and applied additional fraudulent fees on top, until Aldous was underwater and couldn't see a way out. He looked at her. Didn't choose to leave, he was driven out. The room was quiet. Outside, January wind moved along the building, finding the gaps. Where is he now, she asked. Unknown. Graves is trying to locate him. Parrish paused. If he's found, and if he can testify to what was done to him, combined with what the other ranchers experienced, it adds significantly to the case. He looked at her. Understand what all of this means for your land claim. Aldous property sitting empty, she said slowly. Aldous was driven out fraudulently. His abandonment of the property may not constitute a legal relinquishment of the title. Correct. Which means Vance cannot simply claim the Aldous land on the basis of abandonment. Which means, if Aldous can be found and is willing to assert his rights or sell to someone other than Vance, that land does not go the way Vance planned. Evelyn sat with this for a moment. The water source, she said. Creek. It comes through the Aldous land before it reaches the Whitmore eastern boundary. Yes. If Vance controls the Aldous land, he controls the water upstream. Yes. And if Aldous's title is still valid, and your claim on the adjacent 14 acres is confirmed. Vance controls nothing, Parrish said. The entire scheme depends on controlling that corridor of land, and if both those claims hold, he loses the corridor. He paused. That's why Dutton was asking about the eastern boundary specifically. What all the fraudulent fees were pointing toward manufacturing a reason to challenge those boundary lines. Evelyn stood up. She walked to the window and looked at the street and stood there for a moment with her hands at her sides. She'd traced this through the numbers 3 weeks ago. She'd seen the shape of it, the way each piece of the scheme connected to the others, the elegance of it, if you could call fraud elegant. The long-term thinking of men who were patient enough to spend 2 years preparing to take something, rather than simply trying to take it. She'd seen it, and she'd built the evidence and she'd brought it here, step by step. But there was a difference between seeing a thing clearly and standing in the moment when it becomes real enough that other people can see it too. File the land claim, she said without turning from the window. Soon as possible. Today if you can start the paperwork. I'll start today, Parrish said. She turned back and found Aldous. Wherever he is, he deserves to know what was done to him. She told Caleb that evening. All of it Graves. The federal case base. The scope of the scheme across multiple counties. The Aldous connection. She told him in the kitchen after supper, while Lily was doing something in the next room that involved a great deal of quiet concentration, which was always the most alarming kind of quiet from a 5-year-old. Caleb sat across from her and listened, and when she finished, he looked at the table for a long moment. 2 years, he said. 2 years they were working on this. Probably longer in the planning. Vance identified this valley as a target before he started the water source, the land corridor, the properties with manageable debt loads that could be increased with fraudulent fees. He would have mapped all of it first. And he stopped. Jaw did the thing. I paid the fees. Didn't ask enough questions. You were running a ranch alone after your wife died, she said. Without a system for the accounts, with more work than hands to do it. Targeted you specifically because you were in that situation. That's not stupidity, Caleb. That's predation. He was quiet. Ranch is going to be all right, she said. The deed is sound. The fraud is documented. The federal investigation is open. Vance cannot purchase or claim the Aldous land on the basis of abandonment. When my land claim is confirmed, your mother's 14 acres, he said. My 14 acres. She said it steadily, trying it out. Still felt strange in her mouth. The eastern boundary will be held by a legitimate competing claim that Vance cannot move through. Water rights question collapses because the fraudulent registration fee is proven fraudulent. She paused. Going to lose this. Caleb looked at her. You built this case, he said. From the accounts. From numbers in a ledger that nobody else was reading. I read what was there. Parrish couldn't have put it together without what you brought him. Graves is coming because of what you found. He held her eyes. I want you to know I understand that. She looked back at him. Ranch matters, she said. The people on it matter. She paused, then said the rest of it because it was true, and because she'd gotten tired of leaving true things unsaid. You matter. I didn't come here expecting to care about any of this the way I do, but I do, and that's the honest answer. Something in his face changed. The guarded, careful management of it that she'd watched for 6 weeks loosened in a way she hadn't seen before. Evelyn, he said, I'm not asking you for anything, she said quickly. I'm not saying it to ask for something back. I'm saying it because it's true and because I think you should know what's real. She looked at her hands. I've spent 2 years not having anything real to hold on to. I'd rather say the true thing now. He was quiet for long enough that she almost said something else, something to cover it, to smooth it over. Then he said, I've been trying to figure out the right time to say something for about a month. She looked up. There isn't a right time, he said. I know that now. There's just now or later, and later doesn't have anything going for it that now doesn't also have. She almost smiled. That's not elegantly put. I'm not elegant. He met her eyes. I know what this place looked like before you came. I know what it looks like now. That's not just the accounts, Evelyn. Something changed in this house. With Lily here and with you. He paused. I don't want it to be temporary, the fire, the January wind outside. Lily in the next room, still quietly concentrated on whatever she was doing. It won't be temporary, Evelyn said. She said it simply, without decoration, because it was a simple, true thing, and those didn't need decorating. Second part of the Helena response arrived 10 days later, and this one was not a letter. This one was a man. Graves came in person, which Parrish had not expected. Was perhaps 55, compact and precise, with the manner of someone who had spent 30 years in rooms where the details mattered and had organized himself accordingly. Came to the ranch directly, rather than meeting at Parrish's office first, which told Evelyn he was serious about talking to Caleb on his own ground. It also brought news about Thomas Aldous. Aldous had been found in a mining camp in Colorado, working a position he was significantly overqualified for. When Graves's contact reached him and explained what had been uncovered about the scheme applied to his ranch, the man had apparently sat down in the middle of the camp yard and not moved for 10 minutes. He thought he'd failed, Graves said. He was sitting at the kitchen table with Caleb and Evelyn and Parrish, who had come out from town for this meeting. He thought the debts were real, and the fees were real, and the boundary questions were real, and he'd simply been a bad manager. He had no idea any of it was manufactured. Evelyn thought about sitting on the floor of the small office with the survey document in her hands. Way things you didn't know could sit inside you, shaping you, for years. Willing to testify? Parrish asked. He is. He'll be here within the month. Graves folded his hands on the table. Now, I want to go through everything, every document, every payment record, every communication, everything Mrs. Hart compiled, and everything in the original accounts. This is going to take several days. Whatever you need, Caleb said. Graves looked at Evelyn. Parrish tells me you identified the pattern before any of the legal analysis, he said. Not a compliment, exactly more of an assessment. The numbers were clear once the accounts were organized, she said. What made you look for a pattern rather than accepting individual fees at face value? She considered this. Because individually they were plausible, she said. That's how it was designed. Any single fee, you look at it in isolation and you think, administrative cost, bureaucratic complexity, it happens. When you see them together, same timing structure, similar amounts, office names that sound official, but don't match any real administrative body, the individual plausibility stops working. Pattern is what's real. She paused. People who run schemes like this count on being looked at one piece at a time. Don't expect someone to lay all the pieces next to each other. Graves looked at her for a moment. No, he said. They generally don't. He opened his case and produced a thick stack of papers. Let's begin, he said. They worked for the next 4 hours at that kitchen table. The four of them, Graves and Parrish, on the legal construction, Caleb on the ranch history and the direct encounters with Dutton, Evelyn on the numbers, the pattern, the precise sequence of what had been done and when and how much it had extracted. Lily appeared in the doorway at one point, assessed the situation, determined it was serious adult work of the boring variety. Then went back to whatever she'd been doing with Sam. By the time the winter light had gone from the windows and Evelyn had lit the lamps and made coffee for the third time, there was something on the table that was more than documents and more than a pattern of numbers. It was a case, an actual built, documented case that named Roy Vance and Dutton and the two county officials and laid out what they had done and to whom and for how much and over what period of time. Graves gathered his papers at the end with the careful efficiency of a man who respected what had been assembled. I'll take all of this back to Helena, he said. The federal process will take time, possibly 6 months, possibly more. But I want to be clear. What we have here is sufficient. This isn't a question of whether. It's a question of when. After Graves and Parrish had gone, after the sound of their horses had faded down the frozen road, the kitchen was very quiet. Caleb stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the darkness and the snow and the ridge to the northwest that sheltered the hollow where his ranch sat. He turned. 6 months, he said. Maybe more, Evelyn said. Parrish will file a protective order on the land title while the case proceeds. Vance can't move on the property while the fraud investigation is active. Caleb nodded. He looked tired in the particular way of someone who has been holding something at arm's length for a long time and has finally been told he can put it down. Not relief exactly, the muscle memory of tension. Your claim, he said. Parrish is filing it tomorrow. Nodded again. He looked at the table, at the rings left by coffee cups on the wood, at the lamp she'd lit. When the claim is confirmed, he said, you'll have land. Grown. 14 acres along a creek, she said. It's not a farm. It's not enough to build anything on alone. No, he said. He looked at her. But it's something to bring to something. She understood what he meant. She looked back at him and let him see that she understood. It is, she said. Outside, the January wind moved along the eaves with a sound that was not quite the same as a storm lighter. Less certain, a sound of weather that hadn't fully made up its mind. The fire in the hearth gave its steady warmth to the room, and the lamp gave its steady light. And from somewhere in the back of the house came the sound of Lily laughing at something Sam had said. The unguarded, certain laugh of a child who knew she was home. Evelyn Hart stood in the kitchen of a ranch that was no longer in danger of being taken from the man who'd built it, in a valley her mother had left 40 years ago without knowing she'd left anything behind. Run thought about what it meant to find a thing you hadn't known you were looking for. She didn't have a clean word for it. She was not sure there was one. She put it in the place where she kept the true things and went to find her daughter. Thomas Aldous arrived in Millhaven on a Wednesday in late February, and he was not what Evelyn had expected. She had built a picture of him in her mind over the months assembled from the fragments she knew, from the letter he'd written about practical things and quiet and a child in the house being a welcome thing, from what Graves had said about him, sitting motionless in a mining camp yard when he learned the truth. She had expected someone diminished, someone who had the look of a man who had been beaten by something he didn't understand and hadn't recovered his full shape yet. He was that, partly. He was thin in a way that suggested the past year had not been kind to his appetite, and he had the careful, slightly watchful manner of someone who had learned to distrust situations that presented themselves as straightforward. He was also, and this surprised her, angry. Not loudly. Not in any way he performed. It sat in him quietly, the anger like a coal that had been burning for months and had gotten very hot in a very small space. Parrish brought him to the ranch on a Thursday morning. Caleb met them in the yard. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window, then went to the door. Aldous looked at her and stopped. Mrs. Hart, he said. Mr. Aldous. She held the door open. Come in, there's coffee. Came in. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Graves and Parrish had built the case 2 months ago. The same table where she had spread the accounts and found the pattern, and he held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at the surface of his coffee for a moment without drinking it. I want to apologize to you, he said. She looked at him. You don't owe me an apology. I do. He looked up. I sent those letters. I made that arrangement with the agency. I told a woman and her child to come out here on my word, and he stopped. His jaw worked. I should have written when things started going wrong. I kept thinking I could fix it. Every month I thought I had another month, Another chance to get clear of the debt, another way to make it work. And then it was too late, and he shook his head. I left. Without sending word. That's not something a decent person does. Kitchen was quiet. Outside, Percy was doing something in the yard that involved intermittent hammering. You were being systematically destroyed, Evelyn said. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. He looked at her. Are you always that direct? Mostly, she said. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the recognition of one. Graves told me what you found. The accounts, the pattern, all of it. He set down his coffee cup. He said without your analysis, they would have had individual complaints from individual ranchers, which is harder to prosecute than a documented scheme. Said you built the framework the legal case sits on. Parrish did the legal work. Parrish had the pieces because you gave them to him. Aldous shook his head slowly. I've been in that mining camp for 9 months thinking I was a failure. Thinking I'd managed my land badly and let my debts get away from me, and there was nobody to blame but myself. A pause. It turns out someone very carefully manufactured that conclusion for me. Yes, Evelyn said. They did. He was quiet for a moment. What happens now? Graves says the federal case is moving. It's moving. Parrish confirmed from across the table, where he'd been letting Evelyn lead the conversation with the instinct of a man who understood when to stay out of the way. Vance has been formally notified of the investigation. Dutton has engaged his own lawyer in Helena, which usually means he's considering cooperation with investigators to reduce his own exposure. 2 county officials named in the fraud have already been suspended pending the inquiry. He paused. Vance himself has gone quiet. His land company has stopped making offers in this valley. Because he knows he's caught, Aldous said. Because he knows the scheme is visible, Evelyn said. Which is the same thing, for practical purposes. Aldous turned his coffee cup in his hands again. My ranch, he said. Property. Graves says the title may still be valid because I was driven out fraudulently rather than leaving voluntarily. Is that actually possible? That I could get it back? Parrish leaned forward. It's a legitimate legal argument. Whether it succeeds depends on how the court interprets voluntary abandonment under fraudulent duress, and that's not settled law. Yes, it's possible, if you want to pursue it. Aldous looked at the table. He looked at the window. He looked like a man trying to figure out what he wanted, which was its own kind of complicated when you'd spent 9 months believing you'd forfeited the right to want things. I don't know if I want to go back, he said finally. I don't know if I can. He looked at Evelyn. Does that make sense? Yes, she said. A place that was taken from you isn't quite the same place when you try to return to it. He nodded slowly. What would happen to it if I didn't pursue the claim? It would need to be properly settled one way or another, Parrish said. If you relinquished the title formally, the property would go through the standard territorial process. It wouldn't go to Vance, not now, not with the fraud case active. Aldous was quiet for a long time, long enough that the hammering outside stopped and started again, and stopped once more. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I can say right now. I'll think about it. That's enough, Evelyn said. Stayed in Millhaven for 2 weeks, taking a room at Mrs. Finch's boarding house. Evelyn knew this because Mrs. Finch told her on the Thursday supply run, with the particular tone of a woman who has been observing something and has decided someone else should know about it. Comes down for breakfast at 6 every morning, Mrs. Finch said. Eats properly, which is more than he was doing when he first arrived, from the look of him. Mostly sits in the front room in the afternoon and reads. A pause. He asked me once about the valley, what people were like, what the land was like in spring. Like he was trying to decide something. He is trying to decide something, Evelyn said. I know that. Mrs. Finch refilled her coffee. I told him the valley was good land. People who stayed in it tended to be worth staying near. She looked at Evelyn over her cup. I also told him that some things that seem lost turn out not to be. Evelyn looked at her. That's not subtle, Mrs. Finch. I'm 63 years old, said Mrs. Finch. I ran out of subtle about 20 years ago. Graves sent word from Helena in the first week of March. Federal case had advanced faster than anyone had expected, primarily because Dutton had done exactly what Parrish predicted, turned cooperative witness in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony detailed the full scope of the operation, how Vance had identified target properties, how the fictional government offices had been created, how the fees were collected and laundered through a legitimate appearing land company, how the county officials had been paid for their assistance in making the letterhead look real. He named 12 properties across 3 counties. The total amount extracted through fraudulent fees was confirmed at over $900. Several of those properties had changed hands under circumstances that, in light of the fraud, were now under review. Roy Vance was arrested on a Monday morning in Helena and was not released on bail, which Graves's letter described in precise legal language that nonetheless conveyed something that might, in a different kind of letter, have been called satisfaction. Parrish read the letter aloud at the ranch that evening. Caleb, Evelyn, Holt, Sam gathered at the kitchen table. Percy, standing in the doorway, because there weren't enough chairs, and he'd declined the one offered. When Parrish finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Holt said, "Good." It was one word, but it was Holt, and one word from Holt carried the weight of a paragraph from most people. Percy said, "Does this mean the ranch is safe?" "Officially." "Officially," Parrish said. "The protective order on the title has been confirmed. The fraudulent challenge to the water rights has been dismissed. Eastern boundary is established." He looked at Evelyn. "And the land claim in the name of Eleanor Marie Cavett, with Evelyn Hart as heir, has been registered and is proceeding through the normal verification process. I expect confirmation within 6 to 8 weeks." Percy looked at Evelyn. "Own land," he said, with the straightforward amazement of a 19-year-old encountering an unexpected fact. "I will," she said, "when it's confirmed." 14 acres isn't a ranch," Percy said. "No," she agreed. "It's a start." Something in the room shifted at that, a small collective readjustment, the kind that happens when people who share a space understand simultaneously that the space is going to continue to be shared. Holt looked at his hat, which he was holding in his lap. Duh, he looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man composing something. "Chimney on the main house," he said finally. "I noticed it's been drawing a little uneven on the north side." Evelyn looked at him. "I'll look at it tomorrow." "I know you will," Holt said. Put his hat back on. Just mentioning it. Stood, and Sam stood with him. And they went back to the bunkhouse with the unhurried ease of men who knew where they were going. Percy followed them after a moment, with a last look at Evelyn that was still slightly amazed. Parrish gathered his papers and said goodnight and rode back to town. Kitchen settled into its ordinary quiet. Caleb sat across from her at the table for a while without speaking. The fire was low and comfortable, the way fires get in the evening when you stop adding wood and let them settle into their own warmth. "Vance arrested," he said eventually. "Yes, it's done then. Main of it. The legal process will take time still. The federal case, the review of the properties that changed hands. The operation is over." She looked at him. "You're not in danger anymore." Nodded. He looked at the fire. "I keep thinking about the day I found you at the station," he said. "In the hardware store. The way you walked across that room." She waited. "I thought, this woman is going to be difficult," he said. It was not an insult. He said it with something that was close to wonder. Not difficult like trouble. Difficult like this is a person who will not be managed and will not be minimized and is going to require me to be more present than I've been used to being." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I was right." "Is that a complaint?" she said. No, he looked at her. "It's the opposite of a complaint." The fire settled. January passing into March wind found the north side of the house and moved along it looking for gaps. Outside, the valley was dark and snow-covered and wide. Ridge to the northwest, a black line against a sky that was beginning, tentatively, to carry the suggestion of something other than winter. "Lily asked me something yesterday," Evelyn said. Caleb raised his eyebrows. "She asked me if we were going to stay." Evelyn looked at her hands. She asked in the particular way she has of asking things she already knows the answer to, but wants to hear said out loud. "What did you tell her?" "I told her yes." She looked up. "I told her this was home." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Is it?" he asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking the way he asked things when he actually wanted to know. She thought about what home meant. She had thought about it in various forms since the night she arrived in Millhaven with a broken suitcase and a child in her arms and nothing guaranteed. She had thought about it while reorganizing the root cellar and rewriting the accounts and riding in a blizzard after runaway cattle and sitting on the floor of this man's small office with a 40-year-old. Survey in her hands and her mother's name in the margin. "Home is a thing you build," she said. "Not a thing you arrive at." She paused. "Been building it here." "So yes." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a gesture of possession, just contact, one person to another. The warmth of it straightforward and uncomplicated and real. She turned her hand over and held his. Sat like that for a while. In the kitchen, where she'd made 10,000 cups of coffee and reorganized everything and spread accounts across the table and quietly, systematically, helped save what he'd built. Neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed to be said tonight. Thomas Aldous made his decision in the second week of March. Came to the ranch to tell Evelyn directly, which she appreciated. He sat at the kitchen table. One more time, he'd been there twice now for working meetings with Parrish and Graves, and the table had started to feel like neutral ground, place where things got decided, and he folded his hands and said what he'd come to say. "I'm not going back to the property," he said. "I've thought about it every way I know how to think about it, and I can't make it what it was before. It's not the place, it's me. I went out there with a plan, and the plan was taken apart, and I'm not the same person who made that plan anymore." He paused. "That might change. Maybe in a year or two I'll feel differently. But right now I need to go somewhere else and start something different." "I understand that," Evelyn said. "What I want to do," he said, "is sell the title. Properly, legally, at fair market value, once the fraud case establishes that the title is still valid. Not to Vance or anything connected to Vance, to someone who'll work the land and care for it." He looked at her steadily. "Parrish tells me there may be someone in this valley interested in acquiring adjacent property." She looked back at him. "Parrish says a lot of things. Says them accurately in my experience." A pause. "Property shares a boundary with your 14 acres. Shares a water source with Whitmore's ranch. If it went to this ranch, let's say, or to someone associated with this ranch, the whole corridor of land and water rights would be consolidated. Vance would have no leverage point anywhere in the Eastern Valley." He paused. "That's not the only reason I'm considering it, but it's a reason." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "What's the other reason?" Aldous looked at the table. "I wrote to you," he said. "I made a promise. I didn't keep it, for reasons that turned out to be not entirely my fault, but the promise was still broken and I still broke it." He looked up. "This is the closest I can come to making it right." She thought about that for a moment, the strange, winding way that things resolved. Promises that didn't land where they were aimed, but sometimes landed somewhere better. Particular imperfection of human intentions meeting human circumstances. "Talk to Parrish," she said. "Tell him what you've told me. Let him work out the legal path." She paused, and Mr. Aldous, "Whatever you decide, wherever you go next. I hope it's somewhere you can start, without the weight of what happened here following you." He looked at her for a moment. "You're a strange woman, Mrs. Hart," he said, not unkindly, "I've been told," she said. He almost smiled. It was the first time she'd seen anything like it on his face. "Good," he said. "I think the valley probably needed one. Spring came to Millhaven, the way spring comes to high country, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a late snow, mud that froze overnight and thawed by noon. Creek running high with snowmelt, but the right kind of high now, the natural kind that watered the pastures and fed the root systems and made the eastern boundary land green in a way that Evelyn had not yet seen because she hadn't been here for a spring yet. She stood at the fence line of her 14 acres on a morning in late April and looked at the land. It was not dramatic land. It did not have the austere grandeur of the mountains to the west or the wide cinematic sweep of the open range to the south. It was creek-bottom land, mostly good soil, well-watered, with a stand of cottonwoods along the water's edge that were just coming into their spring leaves, that particular yellow-green that only lasts about 2 weeks before deepening into summer. Modest, productive, the kind of land that rewards attention over time. Her mother had stood somewhere in this valley once, had looked at land something like this, and made choices that took her away from it, choices Evelyn didn't know the full story of and probably never would. She had left this behind, and the leaving had passed down through time, through a life in Ohio, through Evelyn's father and Evelyn's childhood, and a marriage and a death and a broken suitcase thrown in the mud of a December platform, until it landed here, in her hands, in a form her mother couldn't have predicted. Evelyn didn't believe in tidy explanations for the way things happened. She didn't believe that suffering had a predetermined purpose, or that hardship built you the way a blacksmith builds a blade deliberately, with a known design in mind. She had watched too many people suffer without any corresponding reward or growth to believe that. Bad things happen to people, and sometimes those people found ways through, and sometimes they didn't, and the finding through was about the person, not about the suffering having been necessary. She believed that where you ended up mattered, that what you did with where you ended up mattered, that the 14 acres her mother had registered and forgotten were now in the hands of someone who would not forget them. who would know what they were and what they were part of, and would work them with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. That meant something, not in the grand cosmic sense, just in the ordinary human sense of a thing being not wasted. She heard hoofbeats behind her and turned. Caleb, coming along the fence line from the direction of the main ranch, pulled up beside her and looked at the land with the same quiet attention he gave things he was taking seriously. "Aldous signed the papers yesterday," he said. "Parrish has them. Property transfer goes to the county office next week." Evelyn turned back to the cottonwoods. "To whom? To you?" Caleb said. He insisted. "Said it was adjacent to your claim and it made more sense than any other arrangement." A pause. "I'll buy the grazing rights from you. For the herd to use the eastern pastures, we worked out a figure with Parrish that's fair. Water rights stay with the land, which means they stay with you." He looked at her. "You'll have water rights on your own property." The practical weight of this settled over her. Water rights in this territory were not incidental. Were foundational, the thing that made land workable, the thing Vance had understood well enough to build an entire scheme around. To own land with secure water rights in this valley was to own something real and durable, something that didn't depend on anyone else's goodwill to remain viable. "That's considerably more than 14 acres, she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "That's fair," he said. "It's fair. You came here with nothing, and you saved this ranch, and you found your mother's land, and you built a case that stopped a federal land fraud scheme and took down a man who was destroying people's lives one property at a time." He met her eyes without any particular drama. "Sounding a piece of this valley is the least that's owed to you." She turned back to the cottonwoods. She could feel the complicated thing happening in her chest, the thing she'd gotten better at not managing away, at letting be what it was. "It's not what I came here for," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's what you found." They stood at the fence line together for a while. A spring morning moving around them with its particular quality of beginning, not the forced optimism of someone trying to feel hopeful, but the actual, physical sense of something opening after a long closed time. "I want to ask you something," Caleb said. She waited. "Not today," he said. "Not standing at a fence. I want to ask you something properly, when there's time and neither of us is thinking about lawyers or accounts or land transfers." He paused. "But I want you to know that it's coming." She looked at him. He was looking at the cottonwoods with the expression of a man who has said something he meant and is now giving it room to exist without crowding it. "All right," she said. "All right, you'll wait, or all right, you know the answer." She considered. "Both," she said. He nodded once. Something in the set of his shoulders loosened fractionally, the way things loosen when a decision that has been made internal becomes external and real. He turned his horse back toward the main ranch without further comment, because Caleb Whitmore was a man who understood when something had been said and didn't need to be said again. She watched him go, then she turned back to her land. Summer was the best the Whitmore ranch had seen in 3 years. This was Holt's assessment, delivered in his characteristic flat Montana way that somehow conveyed more than it stated. The herd was healthy. The water ran as it should. The accounts which Evelyn continued to manage with the same systematic rigor she'd applied from the beginning showed a ranch that was not just surviving but building, accumulating the small surpluses that compound over time into genuine stability. The Brennan brothers received their money back 2/3 of it from the federal recovery process, which was not everything, but was more than they'd expected. Martin Greeley got his $45 returned in full, which he reported to Holt with the puzzled gratitude of a man who had never expected to see it again. 3 other ranchers in the valley received similar recoveries. The amounts were not large, but the acknowledgement that what had been done to them was real, that someone with authority had looked at it and named it and confirmed it, that mattered in ways the money didn't quite reach. Roy Vance's trial in Helena lasted 11 days. Dutton testified for most of the second day, and his testimony was described by Graves in a letter to Parrish as thorough and damning, the testimony of a man who had decided that the only way forward was complete honesty about everything behind him. Vance was convicted on 7 counts of federal fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit land theft. Was sentenced to 12 years and did not appear, from the newspaper account that made its way to Millhaven 3 weeks after the verdict, to have received this with any particular grace. 2 county officials received lesser sentences commensurate with their cooperation. Dutton received 2 years and a prohibition from working in any land-related business in the territory for a period of 15 years. Parrish read the verdict letter aloud at the ranch. on a Saturday evening in August, with most of the ranch gathered in the main room because Evelyn had made supper for everyone, and the occasion seemed to call for the house being full. When he finished, nobody said anything dramatic. There was no cheering. What there was, instead, was the specific quietness of people who have been carrying a weight for a long time and have just been told they can set it down, standing for a moment in the unfamiliar lightness of that. Then Sam said, "That's a decent piece of work." It meant all of it, the verdict. The case, months of building it, people in the room who had done the building, Evelyn said. "It is." She asked Caleb his question before he could ask her his. This was not how she'd planned it. She hadn't planned it at all. Actually, it happened on a Tuesday evening in September, when the light was doing the particular thing it does in early fall in high country, the low golden quality that makes everything look like it's been there forever and should stay. And she and Caleb were at the kitchen table after supper with the accounts spread between them, going over the figures for the quarter. She was explaining something about the feed costs and the winter projections. She looked up in the middle of it, and he was looking at her with the expression she'd come to know, better than she knew most things, the one where all the management had dropped away, where he was simply present, where she could see exactly what she meant to him without any translation required. She stopped mid-sentence. "Caleb," she said, "yes." "You said you wanted to ask me something properly," she said. "When there was time. I remember saying that. You've had time since then." He looked at her. "I've been finding the right words." "You're not a man who needs elaborate words," she said. "You're a man who says the plain thing and means it." A pause. Something in his face settled. "Will you marry me?" he said. Plain. No elaboration. The thing itself stated directly, the way he stated everything that mattered. She had known this was coming. She'd told him she knew at the fence line months ago. Knowing something was coming didn't change what it felt like when it arrived. The reality of a thing was always different from the anticipation of it, always more specific, always more weighted. She thought about Robert. She thought about the promise she'd made and kept and what it meant to make another one. She thought about what promises were. Really not predictions about the future, because nobody could make those, but commitments about who you intended to be and how you intended to meet whatever the future brought. She thought about a woman named Eleanor Marie Cavett who had stood in this valley once and made choices and left. She thought about the things we leave behind without meaning to and the things we come back to without knowing we're going there. "Yes," she said. "Plain, the thing itself." "Yes, I will." He reached across the accounts and the feed cost projections and the winter supply lists and took her hand, and she let him, and outside the September light held its gold for another few minutes before easing toward evening. Lily was told on a Wednesday morning, which was her preference for receiving important information, because she'd decided Wednesdays were her best thinking days. This logic was entirely her own, and Evelyn had learned not to argue with it. Lily listened to the information. She considered it with the grave seriousness she brought to things she was actually thinking about rather than performing the thinking. Then she said, "Does this mean Caleb is my father now?" Caleb, who was sitting across from her, said, "If you want it to mean that, don't have to." Lily thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. "I'll think about what to call you," she said, with the decisive tone of someone who has identified a problem and intends to solve it on her own timeline. "Take your time," Caleb said. She did in fact think about it. For 5 days, she referred to him as Caleb, which she'd been doing for months. And on the 6th day, she came in from the yard where she'd been watching Sam repair a harness and said, "Papa Cal," with the air of someone announcing a verdict. And that was what she called him from then on, and the matter was settled. Sam, when told about the wedding, said, "Good." Percy said, "Oh," then turned slightly red and added, "That's yes, good." Holt, when Caleb told him, was quiet for a moment and then said, "I'll fix the fence on the north pasture before the ceremony. Been sitting wrong for a month," which was, from Holt, a declaration of profound approval. Mrs. Finch, when Evelyn told her, hugged her. Not a polite hug, a real one, the kind that meant something. "Your mother would have liked this valley in fall," she said afterward. Without explanation, Evelyn understood that Mrs. Finch, in her unsentimental way, had been paying attention to more than room rates and breakfast times for the past year. They married in October before the first snow. It was a small occasion, the ranch hands, parish Mrs. Finch, the Brennan brothers, Martin Greeley, a handful of others from the valley who had watched this story unfold over the past year with the invested attention of people whose own lives had been touched by part of it. Justice of the Peace from Millhaven presided. The ceremony was brief and honest, the way both of them wanted things to be. Lily stood beside her mother in a dress Mrs. Finch had helped her make, holding a small bunch of late-season wildflowers with the concentrated dignity of a child who has been given an important role and intends to perform it correctly. Evelyn wore the same coat she'd arrived in. She'd had it repaired and cleaned. But it was the same coat, the one she'd worn on the train for 9 days. The one she'd pulled around Lily's shoulders on the wagon bench with Percy. The one she'd worn into the storm. She wore it because it was hers, entirely hers. And because she had a feeling that the woman who had arrived in it deserved to be present on this day. Not left behind somewhere in the intervening months as though she were someone to be embarrassed about. She was not embarrassed about her. She was, she realized, standing in the October light of a valley her mother had once called home, deeply and specifically proud of her. Not because she had won something, though she had. Not because things had turned out well, though they had. But because she had looked at the worst that could happen: the abandoned station, frozen mud, a broken suitcase, all of it, and she had not decided it meant she was done. She had decided it meant she had to work harder, think more clearly, hold on more firmly to the things that were real. That decision, made in the mud outside the Millhaven station on a December night, had made everything else possible. Not inevitable possible. The rest had been work and attention, and the specific willingness to see what was actually there, rather than what was easier to see. That was the thing she understood now, in a way she hadn't before. Survival wasn't about being strong enough that hard things couldn't hurt you. It was about being honest enough to look at what was real, and stubborn enough to keep going, and smart enough to use what you had. She had not been born extraordinary. She had been born practical and observant, and capable of doing one necessary thing at a time, until the necessary things added up to something large. She thought every woman she had ever known had the same capacity in them. Most of them had never been given the conditions that required it. She did not consider herself lucky to have been given those conditions. But she considered herself fortunate to have found out what she was made of, because there was a particular kind of clarity that came from that knowledge that she would not trade for an easier path. After the ceremony, the valley fed them a meal in the Whitmore ranch house, with all the chairs pushed together, and the table extended with boards, and the accounts books moved to a shelf for the afternoon. Holt sat next to Evan Brennan, and they talked about cattle for 2 hours, with the comfortable intensity of men who have found someone else who considers this a worthy subject. Percy ate too much and was cheerful about it. Sam spent most of the meal talking to Lily, who had opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them. Parrish made a brief toast that was legally precise and genuinely warm, which was the combination he did best. Mrs. Finch did not make a toast, but ate 2 pieces of pie with the satisfaction of a woman who has seen something she wanted to see happen actually happen. Caleb sat beside Evelyn at the head of the table and occasionally touched her hand or her arm in the way of someone who is still getting used to the fact that a thing they wanted has become real and keeps checking, lightly, that it's still there. She let him check as often as he needed to. She looked around the table. Lily, laughing at something Sam said. At Holt's weathered face. At Percy's youth. At the Brennan brothers, who had sat in a drafty farmhouse opening a letter that told them someone had stolen $60 from them by lying about being the government, who had kept the documents just in case it ever needed sorting out. Parrish, who had taken the pieces she'd brought him and built something durable from them. The faces of people who had gathered in a valley in Montana in October to mark something that mattered. She had come here with a broken suitcase and a child, and 11 days' worth of money, and no plan beyond the next necessary thing. She had found her mother's land, and her own competence, and a man worth being honest with, and a place worth belonging to, and a child who called the ranch home, with the certainty of someone who knows what home means, because she's found it. None of it had been given to her. All of it had been in some essential sense built. That was what she wanted Lily to understand someday, when Lily was old enough to hear it, and young enough to carry it. Not that the world was fair, 'cause it wasn't. Not that hard work guaranteed outcomes, 'cause it didn't. Nah. But that you were more than what happened to you. That the moment when everything fell apart was also the moment that showed you what you could build. That a woman with nothing but her own clear eyes and stubborn mind and willingness to do the next necessary thing was not a woman with nothing. She was, it turned out, a woman with everything she needed. October light came through the windows of the Whitmore ranch, her home now, officially, in every sense, and fell across the faces of the people at the table. and the valley outside held its last warmth before winter. And Evelyn Hart, who was now Evelyn Whitmore, and also still entirely and completely herself, sat at the head of her own table and felt, for the first time in a very long time, a specific piece of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be. Not because the world put her there, because she walked there herself.